Hey guys, tonight we begin with a man who's been dead for over 5,000 years and somehow still manages to have more forensic attention than half of modern cold cases. So, dim the lights, get cozy, and let's drift back to a time before kings, before kingdoms, and long before anyone invented the concept of private property. Welcome to the Alps, year 3300 BCE, give or take a few seasons. It's cold, of course. Everything is cold. The kind of cold that freezes your regrets. Somewhere up there, high between what's now Austria and Italy, a man is trudging alone through ice and wind. He's not really the talkative type, mostly because he's about to become a corpse. We don't know his real name, so the scientists called him C, after the valley where his body was found. Not the most creative nickname, but archaeology isn't exactly known for showbiz flair. He's often glamorized as the Iceman, which honestly sounds like he should be in a legit superhero movie. But no, he was just a Copper Age guy with bad luck, basic tools, and apparently a few enemies. Let us rewind to September 1991. Two German hikers are wandering across a ridge called the Tassenjoch Pass, probably arguing over maps, when they spot what looks like an old hiker frozen in the ice. They report it, thinking it's a modern accident victim. But when scientists come to retrieve the body, they realize it's something far older. Like prehistoric, several thousand years old. Cue the bewildered silence and a collective wait. What? And thus begins one of the strangest forensic stories Europe has ever seen. A literal Stone Age murder mystery. CI wasn't discovered like your average mummy wrapped up in linen. No, he was naturally freeze-dried by the Alps. His body, clothes, tools, even his last meal day, were all preserved like nature's most macabre time capsule. You could almost say he's the original deep freeze. Let's talk wardrobe, because it's honestly impressive. For 3300 BCE, he wore a cloak of woven grasses, a goatskin jacket, leggings made from different animal hides, a bearskin hat, obviously a style icon, and shoes stuffed with grass for insulation, all hand-stitched. He would have fit right in at a prehistoric fashion week. Real earthy tones, lots of texture, and 100% biodegradable. But TC wasn't tea. Just hiking for fun. Archaeologists found an impressive set of gear on him. A copper axe, very high-end tech for the time. A dagger, a bow, a quiver of arrows, though only a few were complete, and a small toolkit. He was going somewhere. And based on what his body tells us, someone didn't want him to get there. Now, forensics later revealed something fascinating. An arrowhead embedded in his left shoulder blade. Yep, he was shot. Fatal wound. The shaft was gone, but the flint arrowhead remained lodged deep in his tissue. So this wasn't a happy little mountain hike gone wrong. It was a murder. Humanity's earliest confirmed homicide. Let's pause on that for a second. Someone in the late Neolithic period aimed, fired, and successfully killed this man. And thanks to ice and patience, we know it. It's like CSI, minus electricity. When scientists examined his belongings, they found blood residue from 4 different individuals. 4, which means CIU wasn't alone. Before his death there had been a fight, or at least a scuffle involving other people. Not bad for a quiet, solo traveler from 5,000 years ago. One person's blood was on his knife, another on his arrow, another on his gear. Either he was helping wounded companions, or he was doing the wounding. His story keeps getting weirder the more we learn. For example, his stomach contents were still intact, perfectly preserved islas meal, ibex meat, red deer, einkorn wheat, and because La is never kind to anyone on a full stomach, a handful of herbs. It was eaten just hours before his death. Imaging showed he was struck from behind while digesting it. So yes, humanity's first known victim of lunchtime betrayal. He also had several bruises and cuts, suggesting a fight before the fatal shot. His right hand was injured maybe. He'd been trying to defend himself. There is even speculation he might be been involved in some kind of village conflict before retreating into the mountains. The Bronze Age version of storming out dramatically, if you will. Let's float over to another oddly intimate detail. Tattoos. CIE had more than 60 of them. Not decorative ones, though just simple black lines and crosses. They weren't artistic. They were medicinal, possibly used like acupuncture marks. Most were along his joints, ankles, knees, spine, so the poor man was dealing with joint pain too. Essentially, our guy had arthritis, stomach trouble, old injuries, and still got murdered in the end. Truly, the universe never misses an opportunity. Then there's the age factor. Tests show he was probably in his mid-40s when he died, which is practically ancient for that period. He'd lived a hard life, teeth worn down from grit, bones displaying decades of rugged travel over mountain landscapes. He may have been a shepherd, a trader, or even a local leader. There's no definitive answer, though the copper axe suggests status. Copper was rare, expensive, and a bit of a flex, like carrying a MacBook in a village full of stone tools. Even Cece's DNA tells a story. Researchers sequenced his genome and found that he had brown eyes. Lactose intolerance, like most of prehistoric Europe, a genetic predisposition to heart disease, and relatives still living in Sardinia today. Imagine finding out through genetic mapping that your ancestor was a prehistoric murder victim frozen in the Alps. That family reunion would be awkward. As investigations snowballed literally and figuratively, his discovery redefined understanding of early European life. It showed us that Copper Age people weren't just wandering cavemen. They had specialization, tools, even systems for travel across rough terrain, but also, clearly, murderous tendencies. Over time, the theories piled up faster than the snow did over his body. Some thought it was a raid gone wrong. Others believed he was a shaman hunted down by rivals. Then there's the idea of exile, that he'd fled something or someone. His injuries and equipment suggested battle experience. Not just bad luck, but the one thing everyone agrees on: he didn't freeze to death by accident. The arrow wound was fatal. His blood loss massive. He collapsed, bled out, and was quickly covered by snow. And there, nature tucked him in for a 5 millennia nap. If you visit the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology today, you can literally see himself preserved in a custom cold chamber at about -6 degrees Celsius, resting still as ever, watched by visitors from behind glass. A 5,300-year-old crime scene on display. And somewhere in the Alps, maybe a few flakes of the glacier that cradled him still linger. Time erases almost everything, but sometimes it forgets just enough to let one story freeze in place. Let's drift on, though. In the next part, we'll peel back some of the wilder conspiracy theories, ancient medical clues, and that very modern problem how scientists almost ruined the body before realizing what they had. Because, of course, they did. So, picture this. Yuri, a freshly thawed Copper Age mummy with a murder mystery to your name. You've made it through 53 centuries of glaciers, survived generations of goats trampling across your burial spot, and then, just when you think things can get any weirder, modern scientists roll up in hiking boots and helicopter you out like an ice cube in a cocktail shaker. Let's be honest, CI probably would have preferred to stay frozen. But, alas, human curiosity knows no bounds. And so begins what can best be described as CSI, the Alps Special Victims Unit. It's 1991, and suddenly every scientist in Europe wants a piece of the action. The body hauled out of the ice with, let's just say, less grace than might be ideal. First, local authorities assume they've found a lost mountaineer, and CIE ends up hanging out at the local morgue at a balmy room temperature. No gloves, no protective gear, and absolutely zero understanding of his historical value. The ancient leather and grass cloak treated with household disinfectant, because why not double down on wild guesses? Our hero is poked, prodded, and x-rayed with all the subtlety of a school science fair. The original autopsy even used metal tools, not ideal for a fragile, freeze-dried legend whose skin is thinner than alpine air. In fact, more damage was done in those first few weeks than in his entire multi-millennia nap. But don't worry, scientific pride is a stubborn thing. Of course, what follows is a turf war, as Austrian and Italian officials bicker over jurisdiction. Who owns the mummy? Who gets the copper axe? Who gets to display the world's most awkward archaeological find. It might as well have been an episode of Ancient Territorial Claims, except this time people are arguing in bureaucratic accents instead of swinging swords. Eventually, the South Tyrol Museum in Bolzano, Italy, gets custody. CI is installed, chillier than ever, in a custom climate chamber. Security lights, museum silence, and no chance to stretch his legs, just endless gawking and whispers from school groups, trying not to doze off. Science marches on mostly in soft slippers. Then, the tests begin. First, CT scans, because everyone wants to see inside the mummy the big reveal. That arrowhead stuck in his shoulder, it's the smoking gun. The forensic team finds, through what might be described as enthusiastic scanning, all kinds of modern artifacts mixed with the ancient ones, plastic bags, stray fibers, and occasional specks of lunch from rushed research. Safe to say, CI is history's first victim of accidental contamination. Let's float over to his gear. The copper axe, the unfinished bow, the grass-stuffed shoes. Each item is scanned, catalogued, and then debated endlessly. Scientists argue about the axe's origin, trade route, family, heirloom, spontaneous flex. Of course, nobody actually agrees, because fieldwork is basically ancient guesswork with better lighting. Meanwhile, tissue samples are extracted, everything from bone shards to bits of stomach lining. Each sample is sent to a different lab. And naturally, everyone wants to make the biggest discovery. There's a race for genetic sequencing, isotope analysis, even pollen identification. It's as close to scientific reality TV as the Neolithic period ever gets. And here's another classic twist. While all this is happening, the world's tabloids get wind of Cici's murder mystery. Headlines get snarky. Stories claim he's Europe's oldest gangster, a failed shaman, or just a really unlucky tourist. At one point, tabloids even call him Curse of the Iceman, crediting CII for every accident befalling anyone remotely connected to the project. Someone chipped a tooth. Must be Cici's fault. All this drama and public intrigue means Cici's remains receive more photo shoots than some Instagram influencers. Far from the peaceful, snowy Alps, he's now a superstar of museums, scientific squabbles, and endless what-if scenarios. Meanwhile, in labs, DNA is yanked out of his bones and teeth, sequenced, unpublished with minimal fanfare mid-1990s academic style. Turns out, the Iceman is a walking well, lying cliché of genetic complexity, lactose intolerance, heart disease risk, and Sardinian ancestry, stereotypically Mediterranean. Except with frostbite. Let's tone down even more. Forensic pathologists look through his organs. They spot gallstones, worn joints, and humble signs of serious chronic pain. Poor say, 5,000 years later, and his medical records are public domain. He also had whipworm, delightful parasite. That's as old as civilization itself. If anyone ever felt appropriately tragic, it's him. Then, the final indignity's brain. Because yes, they scanned his brain, or what's left of it. The conclusion, a little bleeding after death. Maybe from that arrow strike. Not exactly the glamorous brain trauma you'd expect. But hey, not every ancient murder gets a Hollywood ending. So there you go. After millennia spent snoozing in the world's most unforgiving fridge, Cici's comeback tour involved an unending chain of forensic probes, scientific missteps, and human curiosity stretched to its dry, ironic limits. Through it all, he remains weirdly relatable, a guy who ate too much, argued with his neighbors, picked a dangerous hike, and ended up as the unwitting celebrity of international anthropology. Let's quietly slide forward. Next, we'll peek into the rival theories about what happened up on the glacier, and explore just how many experts came up with ever weirder stories to explain Cici's last lonely hours. Because, of course, they did. Alright, let's float over to the wild and sometimes hilarious world of CI theories. Because when an ancient murder victim turns up perfectly preserved, guess what happens? Everyone suddenly becomes an expert detective, historian, or conspiracy theorist. First off, there's the classic bandit attack theory. C was a man with a copper axe, carrying weapons and tools, trekking through treacherous mountain paths. So Naturaji, some say he was robbed and killed by rival tribes or nomadic raiders. Brutal, sure, but kind of expected in any story involving prehistoric high drama. Then, the tribal feud hypothesis takes the stage. Maybe CIE wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe he was the actual aggressor, or caught in a family feud that turned deadly. We know his blood mixed with a few other people's on his gear, so there's definitely some human interaction happening. Maybe he was running from a fight, or running towards one, depending on how dramatic you want your Copper Age soap opera to be. Next, there's the shaman theory. Some researchers note Cece's tattoos might have been linked to healing practices, suggesting he could have been a local medicine man or spiritual leader. Perhaps he was sacrificed or killed because he was a threat to rivals, or maybe he just got tangled up in some sacred dispute. Because why not add a spiritual twist to an otherwise chilly stabbing? There's also a version where CIU was simply a hunter-gatherer who accidentally stumbled into a conflict he couldn't survive. Maybe he tried to broker peace or spy on enemies. Hard to say, since prehistoric gossip wasn't very good at surviving ice ages, and because conspiracies are eternal, some folks have even tossed out the foreign spy theory. CIA's an early undercover agent for rival tribes sounds more like a daytime soap plot. But hey, speculation knows no bounds. What scientists do seem fairly certain about is that CI was shot from behind left shoulder and died fairly quickly. The arrow was lodged too deep to remove, suggesting a surprise attack. There were also wounds and bruises consistent with a scuffle, so it was definitely not a polite dinner invitation gone wrong. Curiously, Cece's arrows had no fletching on the usable shafts, meaning he was probably out of effective ammo. So whether he was fleeing or defending himself, he ran out of firepower. Classic tragic hero moment. His final journey might have been a desperate escape, or a mission gone wrong. Some traces of moss and pollen stuck to his clothing suggest he traveled from lower elevations up to the icy pass, maybe in a hasty retreat. One of the most poetic details, say, carried medicinal herbs, like yarrow and gentian, which have pain-relieving and anti-inflammatory properties, so he might have been nursing wounds or digestive issues while trying to survive. Imagine walking through sub-zero weather, shot with an arrow, fighting to stay conscious, and you have the original alpine tough guy. And let us not forget the odd fact. S body shows signs of old injuries. And arthritis was basically an ancient fellow with a lifetime of physical complaints. He wasn't a starry-eyed youth, but a seasoned mountain man, which makes the whole betrayal and murder feel even more tragic. Even today, experts keep revisiting the crime scene, models, and his equipment. Every few years, new technology or a fresh perspective sparks another debate. Was he murdered overland? A lover's quarrel? Political intrigue in a tribe smaller than most modern towns? We may never know. The one certain fact is that TSIE's story is less about a clear-cut solution and more about the messy realities of prehistoric life. Pain, violence, unexpected death, and human complexity, all frozen in time under a glacier. So, as you drift off tonight, just imagine the mountains whispering tales of the Iceman's last steps, long before history picked up a pen to write them down. Welcome back, my late-night history voyage. If you thought TSI was just a guy with an arrow in his shoulder, wait until you see his Swiss Army age pack. His gear isn't just archaeological clutter, it's a survival kit, status symbol, and walking museum exhibit, all rolled into one. First, the copper axe. Not just any metal weapon, the axe blade is made from almost pure copper, hammered and molded into a perfect little murder tool. At 3000 BCE, copper was like the iPhone of materials, rare, expensive, and a bit flashy. Cece's axe wasn't just for chopping wood. It basically said, "Hey, I'm important." Scientists believe this axe could have been passed down for a generation or to a Copper Age family heirloom, handled with pride. Imagine him casually swinging that axe, knowing most folks were still figuring out stone. Next on the list, his unfinished bow. Unlike the shiny copper axe, his bow was more of a work in progress. Crafted from yew wood, it was about 1.82 meters long, and interestingly, only partially His quiver held 14 arrows, but only 2 were fully functional. The rest, just shafts without fletching or points, basically prehistoric sticks. Clearly, he wasn't going into battle fully prepared. Or maybe someone sabotaged his gear. Either way, it's a bit like showing up to a gunfight with a water pistol. His toolkit held various tiny treasures, including a flint-bladed knife, no stranger to slicing and dicing. This was probably his go-to for everything from skinning animals to fierce nail trimming. There was also a small drill made from bone, likely used for making holes in leather or wood. Handy little multitaskers that, oddly enough, make him look like he had a knack for DIY projects centuries before pin. Let's pause for the footwear, because honestly, those shoes deserve their own stand-up routine. See, war shoes stuffed with grass for insulation, a Copper Age way to say, I'm prepared for frosty toes. The soles were bare, deer, and goat hide, layered and stitched tightly, perfect for trekking mountain trails, though probably not very waterproof. Imagine him stepping gingerly on icy rocks, grass stuffing squishing underfoot, trying not to faceplant. His clothing was similarly functional. Deerskin leggings, woven grass cloak, and a bearskin hat, parts of a layered winter ensemble carefully boiled down from local resources. His sewing skills were not to be underestimated. Experts found remarkable needlework that even modern outdoor enthusiasts would envy. No fast fashion here, just pure alpine pragmatism. And then there's this. C carried a pouch with medicinal herbs and gentian, as we mentioned before, suggesting he wasn't just a warrior, but also a bit of a maybe he was treating his own aches, or maybe he was the tribe's go-to guy for herbal remedies. Either way, it shows people back then had some idea of medicine beyond beat it with a stick and hope for the best. This kit tells us stories about C.S. life. He wasn't a simple hunter-gatherer, but a craftsman, traveler, and maybe even a leader. Carrying copper tools meant he probably had some social status, and the complexity of his gear suggests he was used to moving through the mountains regularly. Not your average weekend hiker, by any means. So Sissy's gear is more than just equipment. It's a glimpse into a world where survival was a daily challenge, where your toolkit was a blend of practicality and prestige, made from whatever the mountains could provide, ready to keep drifting. Next, we can explore Sissy's health, his arthritis, parasites, and what his body's aches and pains tell us about Copper Age medicine and life. Or we can dive into the cultural significance of his tattoos, which are anything but decorative. Your call, hey night owls, as we continue this slow glide through Siesti Frozen dossier. Let's get a little more personal. By personal, I mean painfully physical. Imagine trudging through brutal mountain trails with arthritis, parasites, stomach troubles, and a constant low-level pain that's been tagging along for years. That was TSI's daily grind. First up, arthritis. Yepsa E was the Copper Age's poster child for joint pain. Analyses of his skeleton show serious wear and tear in his hips, knees, and spine. So not only did he haul all that gear around, he did it with achy joints. The Tata-C sported those simple black lines and crosses we talk about line up suspiciously close to where his pain was worst, which means those weren't just ancient doodles, but probably early acupuncture or targeted therapy markers. Because why not try to doctor yourself with ink? Now, on to the parasites. CI had whipworm, a gastrointestinal parasite that's basically the prehistoric equivalent of a bad roommate and wanted, persistent, and a drain on your digestive system. No antibiotics or friendly gut bacteria back then, so this little parasite was sticking around for the long haul, probably making him feel lousy and sluggish at the worst times. His stomach contents offer another peek into his health. C ate wild meats and plants, but the presence of certain medicinal herbs in his last meal hints that he was dealing with digestive issues. Yarrow and gentian, known today for anti-inflammatory and stomach-settling properties, might have been his go-to remedies. Imagine being 5,000 years old, still trying to calm the gut after one too many mountain berries. If you think eating rough and hiking all day was enough strain, Sissy's teeth tell another sad story. Suddenly, That Copper Age grit shows up in dental wear, chipped and worn down molars from constant exposure to tough, gritty food. Basically, his mouth did its own alpine workout every day. You can almost picture C as a slightly grumpy, sore, and tired guy, trying to keep it together by poking himself with a bone needle and muttering. Just one more mountain under his breath. And then there's the gallstones. Ease. The ultimate sneak attack of pain. They suggest CIH might have suffered from digestive health issues more complicated than just parasites, and gallstones are no joke, causing some brutal abdominal pain, typically due to diet or genetics. Like many problems in prehistoric health, it was probably helplessly endured or treated with herbal poultices if at all. In many ways, Cece's body is a sad but vivid window into the harsh realities of early human life. Pain, parasites, injuries, and poor health were the norm, not the exception. No modern medicine, no painkillers, just primitive DIY healing and stubborn endurance. Oh, and don't forget the emotional toll, living with chronic pain and illness, in extreme isolation, or with small communities. Probably made C as emotionally worn as his skeleton looks, physically battered. Not exactly the glowing mood you'd hope for in a mountain trek. So, as you sink back, just remember this. Cece's story is not just about murder and glaciers. It's a downer tale of a tough dude doing his best to survive in a world that wasn't designed for comfort. Next up, we can float into the mysterious world of sizes. Tattoos there, meaning medicinal role, and why ink was apparently the coolest painkiller back then. Or, if you prefer, we can continue exploring his final days from a cultural and social perspective. Hey, night owls! If you thought tattoos were just a centuries-old way to say, hey, look how cool I am, you'd be mostly right, but for those black lines and crosses were less about swagger and more about, well, stiff joints and chronic pain. Welcome to the world's earliest acupuncture-ish body art. Cece's body hosts over 60 tattoos. Don't imagine swirling dragons or elaborate sleeves. Nope. These are simple, straight lines and grids, tattooed mainly around his knees, ankles, lower back, and wrists. Sounds plain, sure. But these spots are exactly where doctors today find chronic joint pain, so it's a safe bet that those tats were shortcuts to pain relief. Archaeologists believe these marks could represent a form of early therapeutic intervention, similar to modern acupuncture or in a world without pharmaceuticals. Scratching charcoal into the skin near aching joints might have been a genuinely useful method to ease discomfort or stimulate healing. Sort of like how we've all pinched a painful spot hoping for relief, except CIE went one tattoo deeper. The technique to make these tattoos was also pretty rugged. The pigment was created from carbon, likely from burnt wood or bones, and then rubbed into small cuts or punctures in the skin. And no fancy tattoo guns, here just a sharpened bone or some sort of primitive needle. Imagine explaining your latest tattoo session to your neighbors. Yeah, it's for my arthritis, not just because I'm rebellious. Interestingly, these tattoos are concentrated in places where CIE had documented degeneration and injuries. That suggests someone, maybe C himself, understood the relationship between pain points and this version of body art. It's both practical and poetic, person carrying their pain in ink as well as in joints. Also notable, these tattoos are some of the oldest ever found on a human body, predating Egyptian or Mesopotamian records by a good 1,000 years, which makes CIH not just a murder mystery, but a pioneer in alternative medicine. Who knew? One can imagine C hobbling up those alpine trails, the marks on his skin serving as both a map of his troubles and his hope for relief. It's a subtle kind of courage, wearing visible signs of suffering while continuing a quiet yet powerful statement about surviving in a harsh world. So, Cece's tattoos aren't just ancient doodles. They are a snapshot of early human ingenuity in the face of pain and hardship, ready to keep floating along. Next, we could gently explore the cultural and social backdrop of CIS world, what life might have looked like for his tribe, the politics and conflicts that possibly led to his murder, or even a relaxed dive into how Cece's story reshaped modern archaeology. Hey, night wanderers! Now that we've admired Sissy's piercing shoulder and stylish tattoos, let's slow walk into the bigger picture. The world CIA lived in a time when villages were small, survival was a daily headache, and social life likely involved more awkward drama than festive banquets. Picture a rugged landscape dotted with tiny communities, family groups who knew each other's business intimately and probably exchanged gossip and grudges with equal enthusiasm. There were no kings or empires yet, but social hierarchies were definitely a thing. Cece's prized copper axe wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol, probably pointing to a status somewhere above that guy who chops wood but below tribal overlord. Life at the edge of the mountains was tough. Food was scarce, winters long and bitter, and every day involved work hunting, gathering, making tools, mending clothes. Disease and injury loomed like ominous shadows, while trust and alliances were fragile. Basically, the Copper Age version of don't trust anyone after dark. The politics? Probably petty and brutal. Small disputes could escalate quickly: land boundaries, access to water, or even personal grudges. Remember those blood traces from 4 different people on Cece's gear? That's not a family reunion. It's evidence of conflict, whether it was a tribe feud, a personal vendetta, or just a bar fight with prehistoric spears, isn't crystal clear. One theory suggests C was some kind of messenger or scout traveling between groups or territories. Maybe he was carrying news that wasn't welcome, or had a secret nobody wanted revealed. That might explain why he was ambushed. Or, conversely, he could have been running from something more mundane, but deadly, like an argument gone wrong, or a long-standing resentment finally spilling blood. The idea of exile also floats around. Maybe C was cast out by his community, forced to fend for himself in the icy wilderness. In a world with no prisons or legal systems, exile was a harsh but effective punishment. Survival skills mattered, but social isolation was often a death sentence. Despite all the drama, communities did have rituals and beliefs. C's tattoos and medicinal herbs hint at a spiritual or healing role. He might have been a respected figure, maybe a healer or shaman, whose fall was more than just physical. Losing someone like that would have sent ripples through a small village community. It is tempting to imagine C's last hours as a mix of desperation and betrayal. Fleeting ope, the sting of pain, and quiet defeat under the indifferent sky. Cold, lonely, and betrayed by people not unlike any humans you meet today, just without smartphones and TikTok distractions. So, as your eyelids get heavier, picture the Copper Age as a world of small-scale but intensely human struggles, where survival was never guaranteed. Alliances were fragile, and a single arrow could end a lifetime of stories. Hey, slow night thinkers! As you sink deeper into this ancient story, let's talk about the ripple effect CIH had on the world of science, archaeology, and even cold case investigations. Because this wasn't just a dude stuck in ice, it was a game changer, wrapped in layers of grass and leather. Before Cece's grand unfreezing, archaeology was mostly about digging up pottery shards, bones, and dirt-covered ruins. Important stuff, sure, but often incomplete. CIE flipped the script by arriving as a snapshot of a single moment frozen in time, fully intact and surprisingly chatty about his life, health, death, and environment. His discovery pushed scientists to develop new methods for analyzing ancient remains that were just long buried but perfectly preserved. CT scans, DNA sequencing, isotope analysis, and even pollen studies suddenly became essential parts of the archaeologist's toolkit. CIE was like the ultimate test subject, impossible to fake or misinterpret, because nature did the preserving for free. There was also a newfound respect for interdisciplinary collaboration. Doctors, geneticists, chemists, anthropologists, and even botanists all came together to piece together Cece's story. His case blurred lines between archaeology and forensic science, inspiring new ways to study ancient human health and disease. Think of it as the very first true cold case, solved with modern high-tech forensics and a bit of prehistoric grit. Cece's discovery stirred international debates on heritage laws and ownership too. Italy and Austria tussled just over the rights to display or study him, but over how cultural treasures should be shared and protected. This led to more nuanced laws around archaeological finds near borders, because it turns out even 5,000-year-old corpses can cause diplomatic headaches. Plus, the public fascination with the Iceman triggered a wave of educational programs, exhibitions, and documentaries that brought prehistory out of dusty textbooks and into living rooms worldwide. Let's be honest, a 5,000-year-old murder mystery beats most reality TV plots. In many ways, CI was archaeology's biggest influencer before Instagram, teaching us that the past isn't just about ruins and relics, it's about real people with real stories, pain, politics, and complicated lives. So as you drift through this story tonight, remember, Cece's bones paved the way for a more personal, scientific, and sometimes snarky investigation into humanity's deepest past. His legacy isn't just in the ICS, embedded in every cautious brushstroke of every future excavation. Questions about Cece, their midnight explorers. Just when you thought the Iceman story was locked up in glacier ice, modern science keeps pulling new threads from his ancient tapestry. Despite decades of study, C remains a tantalizing puzzle, with fresh clues popping up like unexpected footnotes in a very long book. For starters, recent advances in DNA analysis have expanded our understanding of CCS genetics, revealing surprising connections to modern populations in the Mediterranean and Central Europe. It is a reminder that ancient human migrations and interactions were far more complex than the caveman stereotypes often suggest. Scientists have also been revisiting his stomach contents multiple times, discovering tiny pollen grains from plants that bloom in different seasons and elevations. This detective work suggests CI traveled across diverse landscapes shortly before his death, possibly within just days. It paints a picture of a highly mobile individual, likely moving with purpose or urgency, not just wandering aimlessly. One of the hottest debates today is about his final moments. Was he really ambushed? Or could he have been involved in some kind of ritual or social punishment? New forensic examinations hint at the possibility that his death might not have been purely violent, but could have some ritualistic layers, that is, murder mystery meets prehistoric spiritual drama. Interestingly, ongoing studies of CS microbiome, the community of bacteria living in and on his body, are offering insights into ancient human health and disease resilience, showing that even back then people were battling the invisible world of microbes just like us. With cutting-edge imaging techniques, researchers are also learning more about his injuries and how they affected him, refining timelines of when each wound occurred. The old arrow, bruises, and cuts are carefully re-examined to understand better who might have attacked him and how he might have tried to defend himself. Another intriguing discovery is the presence of fungus on his leather clothing and shoes, a finding that has inspired new research into how prehistoric people managed or failed to manage footwear, maintenance, and hygiene on long journeys. Because even 5,000 years ago, nothing ruins a hike like fungal infections. All these new angles remind us that TISI isn't just a static museum exhibit, he's an evolving story, as much about modern scientific innovation as about the past. Every new piece of tech or method adds another brushstroke to the portrait of this enigmatic figure. So, as this slow saga winds on tonight, just picture the unknowns, still hiding beneath that glacier ice, waiting patiently to add a few more chapters. Hey, late-night listeners, imagine waking up as a guy frozen in a glacier for 5 millennia and discovering you've become a global celebrity, muse for artists, subject of documentaries, and even the namesake of ice cream flavors. Cece's story didn't just stay in labs, it snowballed into something much bigger, cooler, and a little bizarre. Once his discovery hit news, headlines in the 90 Segundas CIA quickly became a cultural phenomenon. He inspired a wave of books, movies, some better than others, and museum exhibitions that aimed at making prehistoric life accessible and oddly relatable. After all, who doesn't want to hear about a murder mystery older than actual history textbooks? His visage, preserved and a bit uncanny, sparked a fascination that spilled over into art and pop culture. Artists recreated him in sculptures and paintings, sometimes glamorizing him as a stoic survivor, sometimes leaning into his tragic, frozen fate. Not exactly the usual muse, but hey, Variety is the spice of life. A certain spin-off effect, sea-themed. Merchandise, from keychains to t-shirts to board games, people took an ancient corpse and turned him into a quirky, must-have souvenir. Naturally, there are also plenty of memes because when you have a man silently staring out from 5,000 years ago, the internet can't resist. Educationally, CI became the poster child for teaching archaeology, forensic science, and ancient history. His story is a perfect blend of science and mystery that makes dusty old topics feel like late-night detective novels. Teachers love it, students love it, and even the occasional casual Wikipedia browser gets hooked. In South Tyrol, where Sia was discovered, tourism boomed. People make pilgrimages to the glacier sites and museums, eager to catch a glimpse of the guy who's both ancient murder victim and time traveler. In a way, the meticulous cold storage chamber where CI is displayed attracts visitors, making it one of the most chilling but fascinating museum experiences in Europe. Even in science fiction and fantasy circles, CI got name-dropped, or used as inspirational reminder that behind every great fictional frozen warrior or mummy, there's often a real-life counterpart who stumbled into history and refused to let go. So as you relax tonight, think about how one well-preserved corpse managed to outlast mountains, glaciers, and centuries of human indifference to become a storyteller, a teacher, and an accidental celebrity, known and loved far beyond his alpine resting place. Hey, night cruisers! As if being the world's oldest murder victim wasn't enough, CIA somehow became a magnet for pop culture oddities that range from charming to downright strange. Let us skim through some highlights that show how this ancient dude survived everything except our modern obsession with fame. First off, merchandise. CZ's face, or rather his frozen, a bit grayish visage, ended up on everything from fridge magnets to chocolate bars. Yes, that's right, there's chocolate out there. Probably best enjoyed with a warm beverage, unless you want your taste buds to feel ancient too. At some point, a series of Iceman video games and documentaries popped up. Some focused on archaeological accuracy, others leaning towards supernatural thriller territory. Somewhere along the line, CIE got caught between being a stoic prehistoric icon and an unlikely horror figure talk about a mood swing over 5,000 years. In art galleries, sculptures and paintings fluctuated between reverent and eccentric, with some artists portraying CI as a saint-like figure frozen in time, others channeling more postmodern existential dread vibes. Because when your subject is literally trapped in ice, the creative minds go wild. Museum exhibits tend to lean into the cold case drama, inviting visitors to play detective through interactive displays and even virtual reality reenactments. It's like mixing Mozart and CSI, but with grass shoes. There's also a peculiar strain of local folklore around CIE. In the alpine villages nearby, some superstitions popped up post-discovery, including the notion that he brought a curse because what, as a dramatic tale, without a dash of spooky. Thankfully, the curse hasn't stopped tourism, just added a little misty atmosphere, and naturally, the internet did what the internet does best. Memes, jokes, and fan art flooded social platforms. CI memes range from 5,000 years later and still colder than your ex, to the original icebreaker jokes sometimes slightly snarky, always very chill. Despite all this, CI remains a symbol of persistence alive and kicking figuratively in public imaginations. It's a strange, slow dance between ancient tragedy and modern celebrity, all set against the backdrop of melting glaciers and scientific discovery. So, as your eyelids get heavier, imagine ZZ's icy stare watching over us, slightly amused and ever patient with. Hey guys! Tonight, we're gliding back a couple of thousand years, to a time before food delivery apps, before the greasy paper bag that leaks oil all the way home, and long before anyone could complain about tipping culture. Welcome to ancient Rome, where the sidewalks smelled of smoke, cheap wine, and mystery meat being grilled by someone who may or may not have washed their hands since the last Saturnalia. So, dim the lights, forget the modern kitchen. Picture narrow cobblestone streets glowing faintly under flickering oil lamps. There's chatter, clinking cups, and the sound of something sizzling from a clay stove in a little hole in the wall called a thermopolium. That's Roman for hot shop. which sounds fancy, but it's basically a food stall with ambitions. Let's drift in, shall we? The ancient Romans, contrary to popular imagination, didn't all recline on couches, nibbling grapes like overfed cats. That was mostly for the elite, the guys with names like Gaius Aurelius something, who owned half of Sicily and didn't he know what an honest day's work looked like. Most Romans were too busy just getting through the day. They lived in cramped apartments called insulae. The ancient world sans are to high-density housing, often without a kitchen, so naturally they ate out, constantly. Which makes the Roman Empire, oddly enough, one of the earliest civilizations to run entirely on street food. And honestly, it tracks. The city was a loud, messy, glorious chaos of 1 million people packed into a few square miles. Imagine New York without elevators, sanitation, or zoning laws. Fires happened so often that Emperor Augustus eventually gave up pretending to stop them and just built better fire brigades. So, yeah, you weren't cooking at home unless you wanted your entire apartment complex to go up like kindling. So, you walked downstairs and bought a hot stew or some bread dipped in wine. Easy, affordable, possibly edible. The thermopolium, by the way, wasn't a one-size-fits-all operation. Some were tiny corner joints with just a counter and a couple of earthenware jars sunk into the stone. Others were fully equipped establishments, complete with painted walls, decorative mosaics, and maybe an extra jar of slightly less suspicious olives. Archaeologists have found more than 100 of these snack bars in Pompeii alone, which probably tells you two things. 1. Romans loved convenience food. And 2. Volcanic ash is great for preserving other people's bad life choices. Now, these counters had built-in dolia large jars that kept the day's offerings warm or cold. Customers would come by, lean on the marble top, squint at what was inside, and pick something that hopefully didn't stare back. You might find lentil stew, spicy sausages, or chunks of cheese floating in olive oil. Occasionally leftover seafood made an appearance, though refrigeration wasn't exactly a thing. Romans had a strong stomach, or maybe they just didn't live long enough to develop ulcers. Salted fish, for example, was a crowd favorite. They loved it so much, they made garum, that infamous fermented fish sauce, and poured it over literally everything. Think of it as a liquid version of anchovy breath that somehow became a national condiment. Garum factories existed all along the Mediterranean, and the smell apparently carried miles inland, so we can confidently say the entire empire had one big collective sinus issue. But fish sauce wasn't the only weird staple. Romans loved pools, a barley mush eaten by both soldiers and civilians. The humble bowl of pulls was an ancient equivalent of instant ramen, quick, cheap, slightly depressing, and strangely satisfying. Sometimes they flavored it with herbs, honey, or bits of cured meat, if payday had gone well. Otherwise, it was just chunky paste. And speaking of meat, the Roman poor didn't get much of it. Despite what the frescoes suggest, those banquet paintings showing men reaching for roasted peacock legs, yeah, that was pure elite propaganda. Ordinary people were waiting in line for sausages made out of who knows what from a stall called a coup. These small taverns doubled as inns for travelers. Kind of like ancient truck stops, but with more vinegar. Let's drift for a moment into one of these coups. You walk in, ducking under a low archway. It's smoky inside, and the air has that unmistakable blend of cheap wine and week-old grease. The innkeeper, possibly missing a few teeth, but full of entrepreneurial enthusiasm, slaps a bowl on the counter. Inside, boiled chickpeas, stewed leeks, and a generous splash of garum. The house wine is mostly water, but it'll do. You eat quickly, because the guy behind you looks hungrier. Was it fine dining? Not remotely, but it filled the stomach, and in ancient Rome, that was the only Yelp review that really mattered. Now, here's where things get fascinating. Despite their reputation for even wealthy Romans occasionally indulged in street food. Emperor Claudius, for instance, reportedly loved eating from roadside vendors whenever he slipped out incognito, which was often because he didn't get invited to many parties. And the philosopher Seneca, that moral perfectionist who loved lecturing others about simplicity while living in a marble villa, constantly complained about the sounds of frying pans and drunken laughter from the food stalls below. Apparently, even Stoics had their breaking point. Let's not forget, eating in public was also a social event. The Papinarome's version of the tavern, or snack bar, was a place not just for food, but for gossip, dice games, and mild regret. Everyone mingled here. Freedmen, slaves on errands, craftsmen, and soldiers on leave. It wasn't exactly respectable. The Roman elite considered taverns morally questionable, which, coming from people who threw dinner parties featuring roasted flamingo tongues, says a lot. In these small establishments, the line between restaurant and bar was almost non-existent. You came for some beans and ended up slightly drunk, complaining about senators and quoting bad poetry at strangers. Archaeologists have found graffiti on the walls that confirm the vibe. Things like "I was here with my girl and we had a great time," or "Apollinaris served bad wine." A timeless human tradition. Let's also talk about bread, because ancient Rome ran on it. Bread in circuses wasn't just a political slogan, it was the empire's entire food strategy. The government literally distributed free or subsidized grain to keep the people fed and less inclined to riot. Bakers were crucial to city life, and most blocks had at least a communal oven or bakery. Fresh loaves, flat and dense, was sold ready to eat, sometimes with cheese or onions on top. The ancient world's proto-pizza. Street vendors would carry baskets of bread through the streets shouting prices, and people bought loaves on the go. Fast, cheap carbs, powerless to clean your toga after, but effective fuel for a 14-hour workday hauling amphorae or bricks. And then there were olives. You couldn't escape olives in Rome. There were black ones, green ones, wrinkled, stuffed, or swimming in oil. They were served everywhere, often with wine. And yes, the wine was another adventure. Roman wine was strong, often mixed with water, honey, or even seawater. Because who doesn't love a nice saline finish? They drank it hot in winter, cold in summer, and occasionally spiced with herbs or unintentionally with lead, thanks to their piping systems. Let's float a bit into the psychology of it all. Fast food wasn't just necessity, it was entertainment, comfort, routine. For the working class, these little shops were escape zones. Noisy, open, full of stories. You'd overhear a gladiator boasting about tomorrow's bout, a sailor recounting a storm at sea, or a baker's apprentice flirting with a fruit seller, all under the same smoky awning. And, of course, everything smelled of cooked onions. The olfactory anthem of the Roman street, Pompeii, gives us vivid snapshots of this everyday food life. One particularly well-preserved thermopolium has bright frescoes showing ducks, fish, and red amphorae, a sort of visual menu for those who couldn't read. The counter still holds a bronze ladle and leftover bones of duck and pig. Archaeologists even found traces of ancient stew inside the dolia, revealing ingredients like grains, beans, and bits of meat. Vacuum-sealed history, courtesy of Mount Vesuvius' worst day. And speaking of that eruption, here is a curious thought. The same disaster that wiped out entire towns also gave us the best-preserved fast food chain in antiquity. There's poetic irony in imagining a vendor in 7980 Pompeii saying, "Don't worry, I'll be open tomorrow." Something quietly touching lies beneath all this, a sense of blue-collar. These workers, slaves, and citizens, they built and maintained one of the largest cities of the ancient world, and they did it on a diet of bean stew, bread, and hope. While marble emperors dined under gilded ceilings, Terial Rome, the one that breathed, sweated, and laughed, gathered around these smoky counters, spooning lentils out of chipped bowls. Food was never just food, it was survival. Let's drift a little further and peek at some late-night Roman snacks. Comes close to the heart of our modern lifestyle. The theater crowd, after catching a play in the Forum, might wander into a nearby stall, selling pancakes fried in oil, called sweetened with honey and dusted with poppy seeds. They were basically fried donuts. Imagine ancient Romans walking home, fingers sticky, watching torchlight flicker on marble columns. Others preferred roasted nuts, dried figs, or bits of salted pork belly, sliced thin enough to lie about it being one serving. And yes, even the Romans had their version of kebabs, chunks of meat, skewered and grilled. often on portable braziers. Everything from chicken to dormice could find its way onto a stick if you paid the right price. Through it all, vendors shouted like auctioneers. Hot lentils, fresh bread, sausages. The city was noisy by design, a constant low hum of commerce, chatter, and frying oil. Seneca once complained that he couldn't nap because of the yelling of cooks. Poor man. Stoicism really met its match when faced with a deep fryer. Of course, street food also mirrored class anxieties. While the poor ate from stalls daily, the rich occasionally slummed it for novelty. Nero, for instance, allegedly disguised himself and joined the commoners in the streets, buying roasted nuts and drinking cheap wine, playing out his fantasy of being one of the people, possibly the only time he acted relatable before setting things on fire. But even the rich couldn't escape the smell. The entire city was saturated with it. Burnt oil, smoke, and garum winding through every alley. If Rome had an aroma, that was it. And that S where we L pause for tonight is a fast stroll somewhere around a dimly lit popina, the clatter of amphora lids, closing for the night, and the last customer sipping watered wine while arguing about politics no one will remember tomorrow. Because in ancient Rome, that was dinner. A few spoonfuls of lentils, a loaf of bread, and a warm bowl from a man behind a marble counter feeding an empire, one stew at a time. So, we're still in Rome, still hungry, and very much still inhaling the smell of something vaguely edible coming from a busy thermopolium. Imagine leaning against a stone counter in the flickering lamplight, watching the vendor stir a pot with a wooden spoon that probably served 3 generations of stew. The steam wafts up, carrying the familiar scent of lentils, garlic, and a heroic amount of olive oil. You hand over a few bronze coins, and he ladles you a portion like he's doling out destiny. Congratulations! You're now holding a meal that could have come straight from a cookbook written nearly 2,000 years ago. Because, yes, the Romans had recipes. They even had celebrity chefs. Sort of one of the most famous collections attributed to a man named Apicius, though scholars think it was probably written by several cooks over time. Gi Coquinaria. On the subject of cooking is a treasure chest of Roman culinary ambition, and by ambition, here we mean creative chaos, spiced with a casual disregard for food safety. For example, Apicius offers a delightful recipe for dormouse. That's right, stuffed dormouse. You take one small, plump rodent, stuff it with minced pork, pepper, and pine nuts, then roast it lovingly and drizzle it with honey. Because when in doubt, Rome added honey to everything. It is safe to say that while street vendors did sell dormice, too pricey for the average citizen, they did share this same flavor philosophy. Rich, oily, and assertive, Romans loved bold tastes. The more pungent, sweet, sour, or fermented, the better. Subtlety was for barbarians. Take garum again. Apicius treats it like gold. He puts it in sauces, soups, and even desserts. Modern archaeologists have tried to recreate it by fermenting fish guts in the sun, and the results confirm every bad thing you might imagine about ancient kitchens. Yet, for Romans, this was perfection. A well-made garum could signal sophistication the way a good bottle of wine might today. And wine, by the way, was never drunk neat. That was considered barbaric. Romans always mixed their wine with water, honey, or spices in an endless array of variations. Poor people drank posca, a diluted vinegar and water, drinks sometimes flavored with herbs. It was cheap, safe, and probably kept your digestive system alert. Soldiers practically lived on the stuff. As for solid food, the Roman working-class diet revolved around grains, legumes, and seasonal vegetables. Barley and spelt were ground into porridge, then thickened into pulls, that bland but reliable national dish. Chickpeas and lentils filled out most meals, while cabbage was famous enough for Cato the Elder to call it a cure for every human ill. Bold statement, considering it was just boiled cabbage, but when you step into the livelier Thermopolia, you can trace the real flavor of Roman street life. There's isicia, o mentata, the ancient equivalent of a hamburger. Ground meat, Pepper, pine nuts, and fish sauce formed into patties, fried and served with bread. Sold hot and greasy, it became one of the empire's more successful culinary exports. And then there's bread. Always bread. Bakers rose before dawn, their ovens roaring, turning out dense loaves, stamped with insignia to indicate who made them, a handy way to avoid getting blamed for adulterated grain. Bread wasn't always white. Much of it was dark, gritty, and mixed with bran or barley flour. You chewed it more than you ate it, and sometimes bits of millstone grit cracked your teeth. Roman dentistry wasn't exactly thriving. Let's drift across the city a bit, past the markets. The Forum Holitorium, Rome's produce market, bustled with sellers hawking fruits, vegetables, herbs, and oils. Customers came for cabbage, leeks, onions, chickpeas, dates, or even imported delicacies from distant provinces. Oranges. Not yet. Apples and figs were the sweet mainstays, along with honeyed nuts for those who liked dessert with fewer surprises. In the richer quarters, cooks drew from the same ingredients, but exaggerated them wildly. A stew that fed a worker for a few coppers could become an elaborate gourmet experiment once it passed through a patrician-esque kitchen. There, the broth might be strained through linen, scented with saffron, or dyed pink with wine. The end result often looked like something from a modern tasting menu. Small portion sizes and questionable flavor choices included. The real magic, however, remained at street level. Everyone from sailors to scribes gathered where the food was cheap and familiar. You could taste the empire's diversity right there. Falafel-like chickpea cakes from the east, spicy sausages packed in Gallic style, olive pastes from Hispania, and date-filled pastries from Syria. Rome was a culinary sponge, soaking up flavors from everywhere its legions marched. And this is what made the city's food scene so alive. The empire wasn't just conquering land, it was absorbing recipes. Soldiers brought back spices, traders brought preserved fruits, and immigrants brought their food traditions. Even the humblest stew in a Roman alley might carry traces of half the Mediterranean. Of course, with all this variety came a certain disregard for hygiene. Archaeological digs around Pompeii and Ostia have unearthed drains clogged with animal bones, shells, and discarded spoons. Food waste collection was not a thing. Vendors reused utensils, recycled oil far beyond recommended limits, and stored ingredients in open jars next to the street. Flies probably had a more generous diet than some humans, but no one cared much. This was normal. In a city of 1 million, you couldn't afford to be The Thermopolium was your cafeteria, your kitchen, and your social network all in one. Speaking of social life, these places were unashamedly local. The same faces came every day, sitting on the same stools, trading gossip about gladiator mashas, tax rates, or who among the senators was divorcing this week. The shopkeeper knew your preferences. The usual, you'd nod. Lentils with extra garlic, minimal garum, he'd serve it wordlessly. Rome invented regular customers. Then there were the wine shops, or tavernae vinariae. They served watered wine, spiced mulsum orthe, budget-friendly vinegar water cocktail of choice. The clientele leaned toward the lively laborers, sailors, gamblers, and unlicensed philosophers. These were bustling places where conversations dissolved into arguments and songs as the night wore on. The city's moralists disapproved, of course. The more wine a Roman drank, the more un-Roman his behavior was said to become, which is funny, considering no nation ever loved a public party more. Sometimes regulations tried to rein in food stalls. Certain emperors cracked down on nighttime operations, claiming they obstructed traffic or lured gamblers and pickpockets. Yet, no decree ever truly stopped them. Humanity's need for late-night snacks was apparently stronger than imperial authority. Let's glide briefly toward the vendors themselves. The backbone of this entire ecosystem. Many were freedmen or small entrepreneurs renting city space. Some were slaves earning money to buy their freedom. You'd find them setting up at dawn, shouting to attract breakfast customers. Their tools were simple: braziers, clay jars, ladles, and an indifference to personal space. Yet their rhythm, the chop of knives, the hiss of oil, the constant murmur of sails, was what kept urban life audible. Inscriptions even mention the pastars, the Bakers' Guild, and koki the cooks. These professions had a defined place in society, though not a noble one. You weren't exactly climbing the social ladder by selling lentil stew. But in Rome, a steady clientele meant a steady life. No small accomplishment in a city addicted to drama. Now imagine night falling again. Oil lamps flicker. The air cools a little, and the streets settle into that strange, restless quiet between dinner and sleep. Somewhere, a vendor is still scraping the bottom of his pot, saving leftovers for the morning rush. The last customers leave, belching faintly of onions and wine. A cat slipped behind the counter, hoping for scraps. Tomorrow, it all begins again, before dawn. Same smells, same stew, same city. Routine, endlessly comforting. The rhythm is almost meditative. And that's the heart of why Roman street food feels so modern. Not in its ingredients, because no one today is getting excited about salted eel piti, but in its atmosphere. That shared hum of ordinary people eating together. The fact that someone 2,000 years ago bought bread from a stall because they were tired after work is quietly humanizing. Empires come and go, but lunch breaks are eternal. Even Apicius, with his elaborate indulgences, couldn't escape that truth. Beneath the gold-trimmed recipes for flamingo tongue and spiced wine jelly, there was still the familiar comfort of lentils, chickpeas, and bread. Roman cooking, for all its extravagance, was rooted in peasant practicality. Without the street cooks preserving those daily habits, the empire's entire food chain might have collapsed into death. So the next time someone imagines Rome as an empire of excess senators lounging while slaves pour wine, picture instead a smoky counter at dawn, a cook wiping his hands on a linen apron, a jar of lentil stew still warm, and a customer tossing a coin across marble scratched from years of use. That's real Rome. Not the palaces or the sculptures, but the sizzle of onions in an oil pot, the quiet murmur of another morning, the promise of one more meal before the world collapses again into noise. So, now that we've wandered through the humble stew, pots, and lively counters of the everyday Roman, let us lift the veil a little on what was happening at the other end of the food spectrum. Yes, the one where food wasn't just nourishment, it was a weapon, a conversation starter, and sometimes a confusing status symbol. Welcome to the world of Roman elite dining, where the phrase, maybe less is more, was obviously not yet invented. The same empire that fed the masses with lentils and stale bread also boasted table settings fit for gods, or at least what rich Romans thought the gods might eat if they liked garum so much. Spoiler, they probably didn't. Importing food was a big deal, because why settle for local olives or plain figs when you could have dates from Arabia, pepper from India, or a swan roasted with flamingo tongues for flair? The empire's vast trade networks funneled in everything rare and precious, which only fueled the obsession among Rome's high society to outdo one another at banquets. Take, for instance, the humble peacock. Yes, that showy bird was not just admired for its feathers. It ended up on plates, often roasted whole and stuffed with all kinds of unwanted surprises, like live birds sewn inside it for theatrical effect during the meal. Because why not double down on the weird? The dinner party wasn't just food, it was a spectacle. And speaking of spectacles, get ready for the flamingo tongue. A delicacy that's as extravagant and perplexing as it sounds. Royals and senators paid exorbitant sums for dishes featuring this prized organ. The tongue was considered tender, flavorful, and an absolute must-have for anyone who wanted guests to remember their banquet, or at least pretend to. This wasn't simple eating. Meals became a competition, a way to showcase one's global connections and immense wealth. Cato, the elder, ever the curmudgeon, mocked these extravagancies, grumbling about people who'd waste hours and fortunes on gustatory nonsense while farmers starved. But the parties went on anyway. Garum at this level transformed from salty fish sauce to a precious, refined product. The best garum came from coastal factories in Spain and North Africa and could sell for prices rivaling gold. Connoisseurs claimed subtle flavor differences depending on fish species, fermentation time, and even the particular amphora it was stored in. Recipes from Apicius reflect this obsession well. He offers concoctions with multiple layers of fish sauce, vinegar, wine, honey, and exotic spices like silphium, a now extinct herb so prized it was worth its weight in silver. Its absence today feels like the ancient version of missing saffron or truffle oil. The Romans were truly chasing the tastes of gods, or at least gods of X's. And spices. The spices. Pepper was the crown jewel. It arrived on slow, dangerous caravans from India, across deserts and mountains. A pound of pepper was worth its weight in gold. Wealthy Romans sprinkled it liberally, confident that their guests appreciated the struggle behind every pinch. Trade in luxury foods was so important it shaped politics and wars. Controlling spice routes meant controlling appetite and, by extension, power. The elite's kitchens looked very different from the relying on lentils street stalls. They had multiple cooks, trained to prepare intricate dishes, kitchens equipped with marble benches, special ovens, and separate rooms for marinating, baking, and roasting. All overseen, naturally, by a demanding head chef who occasionally doubled as a food showman. Dinner parties were formal events stretching over hours, or even days, if you were the emperor. Guests reclined on triclinia, those famous three-couch aranhemen, nibbling delicate courses between philosophical debates or poetry readings. Dishes were often so heavily spiced and sweetened they barely resembled anything edible. Imagine a stew that's part sauce, part sweet soup, part confusion, but everyone pretended to love it because social etiquette demanded it. Sometimes, the meals got so absurd that even the Romans paused. One recorded occasion involved a course of live oysters placed on guest skin to enhance sensual experience. The line between food and performance blurred so much it might be given today, dining theaters a run for their money. Luxury food also became a way to assert power. Emperors used extravagant banquets to impress ambassadors and senators. Nero's infamous parties included so much food that it reportedly crashed the city's grain supply, sparking brief panic among the populace. Among historians, such stories illustrate that Rome's elite sometimes ate as if the empire itself depended on keeping them distracted. But behind all this opulence was often a rather fragile foundation. The pressures of maintaining an extravagant lifestyle led some wealthy Romans to bankruptcy or social ruin. Spending fortunes on imported delicacies was a gamble. Impress your peers, or end up mocked for excess. Some emperors tried to regulate luxury food spending, though success was limited because, well, when you're rich, rules are just polite suggestions. That said, even among the elite, simplicity occasionally made a surprise appearance. Cicero, the lawyer and orator, famously enjoyed little more than a simple meal of bread, olives, and cheese on occasion. But let's be honest, not between the feasts, and the food obsession wasn't just about flavor. It was about control. Controlling what you ate meant controlling how others saw you, defining your identity not by your deeds, but by what you displayed on a silver platter. In an empire built on spectacle, food was another kind of performance art, slow, deliberate, and occasionally, incredibly So as you picture another banquet hall somewhere in imperial Rome, remember this. Between the gilded columns and flowing wine, the real story was how food mirrored power, ambition, and the strangely human need to outdo the neighbors, or at least make them swoon over the flamingo tongues. So now that we've seen both the street food hustle and the opulent banquets of the elite, it's time to float back out into the open air. Markets, the festivals, and those seasonal moments when Rome came alive in food and celebration. Ancient Rome wasn't just an empire of streets and palaces. It was fundamentally a city of markets, and these markets were life, all wrapped up in a fragrant, chaotic jumble of sights, sounds, and smells. You'd find vendors setting up before dawn, stalls heavy with crates of fruits, vegetables, nuts, and oddities that made the Roman palate tingle or recoil. The Forumborium was a well-known meat market close to the Tiber River where butchers hawked everything from pork joints to the occasional goat. Blood ran freely, and the smell was ... memorable. But this wasn't just about food. It was theater. Hog casings hung like strings of beads, dogs and children competed for scraps, and vendors shouted their wares in a frenzy of bartering that had its own rhythm. Moving into the Forum, Holitorium, the vegetable market, things got a bit fresher but no less colorful. Bunches of leeks, radiant heads of cabbage, juicy dates, and fragrant herbs competed for attention. Buyers scrutinized produce for quality. A slightly wilted carrot might mean the difference between a happy family supper or a lecture on Roman frugality. But markets weren't just functional, they were social hubs. Elderly women swapped child-rearing tips, young lovers carved time into their schedules to meet over baskets of fresh figs, and slaves dashed between counters running last-minute errands. The market was one of the few places where Romans crossed social boundaries, united by a shared need to eat. Of course, some markets specialized beyond mere food. Fish stalls offered the freshest catches from the sea, often displayed atop beds of crushed ice, an impressive feat for the time, or covered with wet cloths to mask the inevitable smell. Fishmongers argued loudly over quality, proclaiming their stock caught just this morning, which was sometimes true and sometimes optimistic. Close to the common Roman was the exotic sump of the spice markets. Behind curtains, in certain districts where the most expensive pepper, cinnamon, and imported nuts were peddled. These were the preserves of merchants dealing with moneyed clients who used imported delicacies to display wealth rather than satisfy hunger. The calendar wasn't just for remembering taxes or senate meetings. It was also a schedule for feasts, markets, and festivities. Often food. The Saturnalia, for example, was a massive December feast where social roles flipped. Slaves ate first, and excess was the order of the day. Families gathered, markets overflowed, and food flowed freely, usually spiked with an unwise amount of wine and laughter. Then there was the Loop, a midwinter festival involving goats, rituals, and more eating, which was good because after the cold months any excuse for rich food was embraced. Vendors prepared special dishes, vendors crowded stalls with festive goods, and the city practically smelled of roasted meats and spiced bread. Seasonality shaped the entire Roman diet throughout the year. Spring brought fresh greens and early fruits. Summer was the height of hospitality with figs, plums, and the first grapes arriving from vineyards. Autumn was a time for harvest festivals and olive pressing, when new oil-filled jars and markets were alive with celebration. Winter, while more muted, was marked by hearty stews and preserved foods that could survive months underground. Markets could be perilous too. Pickpockets thrived in crowded streets. Vendors sometimes adulterated their goods, selling diluted wine or ground chalk for flour, and inspections were half-hearted at best. This led to occasional public outrage and mild imperial action. But mostly, Romans accepted the chaos as part of life's spice. Feasts also carried social and political weight far beyond food. Public banquets and games were tools emperors used to curry favor. The famous phrase, bread and circuses, wasn't just about free grain. It included massive feasts during public holidays, where food was both an offering to gods and a reminder of imperial largesse. The city's appetite and its rulers' popularity were oddly intertwined. Even common folk got to participate in these communal moments. Local guilds, temple festivities, and neighborhood associations hosted their own food celebrations. Banquets might include simple bread, garum-dressed vegetables, and wine diluted from the less fancy stores. But for a while, under flickering oil lamps, they got to taste a slice of shared humanity. Markets and festivals, in their cyclical ritual, grounded the city in rhythm and community. In a sprawling metropolis where anonymity was everywhere, these food-centered gatherings created pockets of belonging. Here, names were remembered, debts settled, and friendships built over spilled oil and shared olive pits. And as night fell on the city after a festival or market day, the streets filled with the tired but contented sounds of cleanup, quiet gossip, and the soft clinking of pottery being stacked for tomorrow. Somewhere, a vendor might still argue over prices or grumble about greedy customers, while residents retreated home to rest, belly full and briefly at ease. Because that, in the end, was the real Roman magic. Food shaped not just the body, but the very pulse of a city. Its people, its power, and its endless appetite for life no matter how messy or smoky it got. So by now, we've tasted the good, the bad, and the oddly extravagant of Roman street food and elite banquets. But of course, no bustling, emperor-sized kitchen runs itself smoothly. Enter the Roman government, because every sprawling city eventually hits that inevitable crossroads where they ask, how do we make sure the food doesn't tea poison everyone? Spoiler alert, not very well. Rome's authorities recognized early on that controlling the food supply was critical not just for health, but for social order. After all, a city where peasants regularly ate bad stew was a city primed for unrest. This led to a series of laws and regulations designed to oversee food quality, vendors, prices, and hygiene. Sounds sensible, right? Well, not quite. The Romans may have been pioneers in many fields, but food safety wasn't exactly their strongest suit. Regulations existed in theory, but enforcement was a different game, like trying to herd cats with a wooden spoon. One of the best-known laws was the Lex Fermentaria, which regulated the distribution of grain to citizens free or subsidized as part of the famous bread in the bread and circuses. It set prices and quantities to prevent price gouging and famine. Government officials kept close tabs on grain stocks, and city magistrates occasionally showed up unannounced at markets to check quality, though bribery was widespread, and a few rotten deals slipped through the cracks. Then there was the curators annone, officials specifically tasked with supervising food supply, the food police, if you will. These folks were in charge of measuring the weight of bread loaves, inspecting vessels of wine, and making sure vendors didn't sell diluted or outright fake products. But imagine showing up at a smoky thermopolium, wielding official scrolls demanding to taste every stew sample and check every pot for proper garlic content. Vendors often met inspectors with heavy sighs, knowing a slip-up could mean a fine or closure. Yet, food inspectors also had to be wary. Bribes were as common as breadcrumbs, and the richest sellers had powerful friends. The baking industry attracted particular attention. Bread was a basic staple, the very foundation of existence for many. Roman laws dictated not only weight, but even the design of bread stamps used to identify the baker. This was both to prevent fraud and to trace contaminated batches. Still, adulteration was rampant. Flour was sometimes mixed with chalk or sawdust to increase volume. Wine cellars were notorious for watering down product, often with such enthusiasm that drinking it might be more hydrating than intoxicating. The poetic license granted by the phrase in vino veritas, in wine, is truth often clashed with the reality of swill disguised as wine. Food fraud scandals occasionally made the news. Well, Roman gossip columns, inducing moral outrage mixed with the usual resigned acceptance. A famous incident involved food labeled as prime fish actually being reused leftovers from the previous day, sometimes passed off as aged delicacy. Several vendors were publicly reprimanded, though the courts sometimes treated the matter with the same seriousness as a parking ticket. Public health was another mess entirely. Rome had impressive aqueducts and public baths, but foodborne illness was common, especially in a city packed with over 1 million inhabitants, lacking modern sanitation. Stalls located over open sewers and refuse heaps contributed to outbreaks of dysentery and other stomach ailments. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii and Ostia reveals rat infestations and fly populations so dense they left permanent marks. Yet, food vendors continued business as usual, visibly unfazed. The Romans either lacked the means or the will to enforce hygiene standards by modern expectations, or both. One of the strangest quirks was the liberal use of silphium and garum in cooking and medicine. Silphium, now extinct, was a herb so prized it was worth its weight in silver. Ancient texts credit it with curing countless ailments, though whether this was placebo or miracle remains a mystery. Garum itself, the famous fermented fish sauce, had foul odor and likely bacterial hazards, but was so beloved it was basically the ancient equivalent of ketchup poured on everything to disguise less appetizing ingredients. Romans may have enjoyed it, but modern taste buds are left wondering what exactly garum breath was like. Despite all this, tempi didn't fall because of poor food hygiene, but it certainly added to the general weariness and shorter lifespans. The average Roman citizen faced threats from foodborne illness, malnutrition, and accidents in the marketplace. all contributors to an existence far less graceful than the marble statues indicate. Adding to the chaos were the occasional food riots. When grain shipments were late or poor harvests threatened staple supplies, citizens would take to the streets, shouting slogans with a fervor usually reserved for gladiator match outcomes. Agents tried to placate crowds by distributing free bread or wine. But these gestures were temporary band-aids, not lasting solutions. One food-related public scandal involved the Emperor, known for wild excesses, who reportedly served diners dishes so bizarre they defy belief, including peacock brains and parrots stuffed with more. Though part legend, it highlights how culinary excess could border on the grotesque and be fodder for gossip and criticism. Rome did fare somewhat better than some ancient cities in managing food crises, thanks to its vast imported grain reserves, but it was a constant balancing act. Governance was reactive, temporary, and often entangled with corruption or political agendas. Looking back, it's almost comforting to realize that no matter how advanced or decadent a society might be, the basics of food safety and quality control remain stubbornly difficult. The Romans tried, stumbled, bribed, and argued over it, just like vendors and food inspectors do today, except with more garum and fewer food trucks. In the grand sweep, the city's food laws and scandals are a reminder of constant human struggle, feeding a million hungry mouths, keeping them safe, and trying not to poison your customers in the process. It's faintly heroic in its own quiet way. If the Roman Empire was a living organism, its vendors were the heartbeat, sometimes irregular, occasionally rattling, but endlessly persistent. Behind each steaming pot, behind every shouted special, stood someone with a story, a struggle, and often a slice of tragedy. Rome's food vendors weren't glamorized figures, hardly the stuff of epic poetry or statues, though someone probably should have tried. More often, they were freedmen hustling for every coin, slaves dreaming of freedom, or aging craftsmen stubbornly refusing to cede their patch of street. Picture one such vendor, Gaius, a former slave-turned-cook, who barely escaped chains, only to find that street vending was its own kind of trap. His stall was a tiny affair squeezed between a noisy tannery and a temperamental bakery. Every morning, before dawn, Gaius was up, hauling sacks of grain and charcoal, preparing for another day of slicing vegetables, stirring stews thick with garum, and calming the occasional brawl between drunken customers. For many vendors, illness was an ever-present threat. Without modern medicine or sanitation, simple cuts from knives could fester, and every sneeze carried unseen dangers. Gaius, you see, suffered from a persistent cough, possibly tuberculosis, a constant reminder that survival was never guaranteed. Economic pressure was mostly brutal. Rent on stalls skyrocketed, and official fees drained earnings. Some vendors resorted to cutting corners, watering down wine, skimping on ingredients, or hiding old leftovers under fresh gun. Others clung stubbornly to honesty, which didn't always pay well. Socially, vendors hovered at the edges of respectability. The city's elite often sneered at the Thermopolium crowd, dismissing them as lowlifes and worse. And yet, these vendors were indispensable. The wealthiest patricians might disdain street food, but they never quite escaped. It was always a heartbeat away from their palaces, an essential backup when the kitchens failed or late-night hunger struck. Women vendors faced additional challenges. While many ran small eateries and taverns, they lived precarious lives, balancing household duties with economic survival. Some took risks invisible to most contemporaries, staving off moral suspicion while negotiating with powerful clients, managing accounts, or even becoming unexpected community leaders in their neighborhoods. Then there's the small but vivid world of the Popani, Roman taverns, where food and drink flowed alongside stories good and bad. These weren't just rest stops, they were stages for small dramas. A vendor might find himself witnessing a child's first rite of passage, a soldier's last night before deployment, or a lover's tragic farewell. One faded inscription from a Papina wall in Pompeii reads, "Marcus served the best wine and worse advice." A tiny, human touch buried beneath centuries of dust, reminding us that even in food, life's messy theater played out unscripted. The streets themselves were often unforgiving. Slips on spilled oil, burns from open fires, or injuries from jostling crowds were daily hazards, each incident potentially a disaster without any real safety net. A vendor crippled or sick could mean destitution for families relying on the stall, and death was no respecter of vendors. When Vesuvius erupted, many food traders in Pompeii perished mid-service, their last meals still warm in cracked pots. Archaeologists have found their remains frozen in time, an eternal snapshot of a life interrupted. Amidst hardship, there were small moments of joy and pride. Vendors took pride in their recipes and the loyalty of customers. Some expanded their offerings, bringing in small luxuries when fortunes allowed. The simple act of feeding a city became a statement of endurance and hope. The daily grind was punctuated by festivals and market days, rare opportunities to rake in profits, but also times of chaos and danger. The increased crowds meant more sales and more theft, more fights, and more pressure. Vendors learned to navigate this volatile environment, developing informal alliances, sharing warnings, and maintaining a fragile social network. In quieter moments, many vendors carved their names or messages into counters, tables, or walls. These graffiti, scattered across ruins, reveal the human side of vending: humor, frustration, love, and dreams whispered into stone. There was also a darker edge. Some food stalls doubled as fronts for illicit deals, or were tied to criminal elements, blurring the lines between sustenance and survival in a city of stark inequalities. This shadow economy added tension to the honest vendor's life, sometimes pushing them into complicity or conflict. Despite all this, the vendor's role was fundamental. They weren't just providers of food, but custodians of a city's rhythm, culture, and spirit. Every stew ladled, every loaf sold, was a quiet act of connection amid the empire's vast machinery. So next time you imagine ancient Rome, think not just of marble columns or imperial palaces, but of Gaius standing behind his stall, stirring his stew as the city wakes a small, steadfast pulse in the heart of an empire. If you've ever wondered exactly what was simmering behind those marble counters and earthenware pots, this is your chance to slow down and savor the details. The ingredients and tools that shaped the daily taste of Rome. First up, the cornerstones of Roman street food weren't exotic spices or lavish peacock tongues. Nope. At its earth, the food was built on some simple, stubborn basics: grains, pulses, vegetables, and a surprising amount of fish, or at least something that tried to taste like it. Grains like wheat, barley, and spelt were everywhere, ground into coarse flour for bread, or boiled into that thick porridge called pulse. This sticky, slightly gritty mush was often the default meal for poor Romans. It wasn't haute cuisine, but it filled bellies and offered some nutritional balance. Vendors would offer it plain or jazz it up with bits of olive oil, herbs, or whatever scraps of meat could be spared. Lentils and chickpeas were the favorite pulses of the day, loved for protein and versatility. Lentil stew, thick and hearty, often punctuated with garlic, onions, or cumin, was one of the most common street offerings. Chickpeas appeared fried or in patties. Imagine ancient falafel cousins, street food long before Middle Eastern cuisine got fancy. Vegetables were seasonal and regional: cabbage, leeks, carrots, onions, garlic, all staples. Romans believed cabbage, boiled until nearly forgettable, had healing powers powerful enough to cure every human illness, which, if you ever tasted it, might have been more wishful thinking. Fresh herbs like dill, coriander, and mint were liberally tossed in, giving a vivid lift to otherwise simple dishes. Fish and seafood had a surprisingly central role. Fresh fish was mostly for the wealthy, but salted, pickled, or dried varieties, including the famously pungent garum, were street food staple. Garum deserves its own moment. A fermented fish sauce made by rotting fish guts in the sun for weeks, until it became a punchy, salty condomen Romans poured over almost everything. Modern taste buds retreat in horror, but Romans saw it like liquid gold. And let's not forget, all is black, green, pickled, stuffed, or swimming in oil, constantly present for garnish or snack, and central to cooking and eating habits. Cheese was common, too soft and crumbly, made fresh or cured, usually sheep or goat milk. It was as much a staple as bread or beans, and often added a welcome saltiness to bland dishes. When it came to meat, well, let's just say Roman street food was frugal. Pork was the most popular animal, usually from pigs raised in backyard pens or the countryside. Sausages made from leftover scraps, seasoned with mild spices and stuffed into intestines, were a big seller. Chicken and fish were less common, and red meat, beef, lamb practically a rarity for vendors catering to everyday folks. Now, picture the tools of the trade. Vendors operated simple but effective kitchens, portable, robust, and built for efficiency, not elegant. The thermopolium counters hosted dolia, those large built-in clay jars where stews, porridge, and wines simmered or cooled. Dolia kept food at the right temperature and doubled as visual menus. A patron could glance into pots and decide if the day's offerings suited their appetite or bravery. Cooking was done over wood or charcoal braziers, portable metal or clay stoves. Earthenware, pots and pans, often blackened from years of use, simmered the staples. Knives were essential for slicing vegetables and meat, and wooden spoons stirred the ubiquitous stews. Bread was baked in communal or private ovens, sometimes brick structures with domed tops that radiated heat evenly. Vendors would carry fresh loaves on trays or in woven baskets balanced on their heads, using linen cloths to keep the crust just right. Serving vessels were simple. Bowls and cups made of clay, sometimes painted or glazed, practical and disposable. Wooden or bone utensils happened, but weren't common for street food, where eating was often as casual as possible. Food was frequently eaten with fingers or dipped bread, which doubled as both utensil and side. Spices, expensive and precious, were stored in small containers or flasks. Pepper, cumin, coriander seeds, and silphium, now extinct but highly prized, added layers to flavor profiles, carefully rationed to keep both taste and cost right. Salt was as valuable as seasoning as anything else, and stored in ceramic jars. Romans knew salt preserved food and sharpened flavor, so it was a kitchen constant. Oil, especially olive oil, was the backbone of Roman cooking. It lubricated pans, dressed salads, and was even used medicinally. Street vendors bought oil in bulk, likely from Mediterranean producers, storing it in narrow-necked jars designed for transport. Let's imagine the sensory scene. The rough texture of bread under fingertips, the slightly oily sheen of lentil stew, the pungent whiff of garum thick. In the air, the occasional crunch of a roasted chickpea or a piece of salted fish. Vendors worked with simple ingredients, but layered them to coax surprising complexity, enough heat, salt, and sweetness to keep customers coming, but never so much as to strain the purse. The tools and ingredients shaped not just food, but experience. A vendor's success often depended on subtle shifts, roasting the onions a little longer, choosing a fresher batch of herbs, or carefully hiding the smell of yesterday's spoiled fish with vinegar and spices. Behind every stew was a recipe tweaked by necessity and tradition, handed down from cook to cook, simmered in pots, and ladled into bowls that fed the teeming city's soul.
If the streets of Rome were its arteries, then the food markets were the beating heart pumping life and colour through the city. These markets weren't just places to shop, they were the thrum of daily life, where routine met ritual in a dance as old as the empire itself. Every day, before the first light crept over the Tiber, the market quarter woke in a blur of action. Vendors, carrying wicker baskets brimful with fruits, vegetables, grains, and fish, jostled as they set up their stalls. The air was thick with the scent of fresh produce, crushed herbs, and the faint tang of salt water from the nearby fishmongers. It was a carefully choreographed chaos. Sellers shouted their wares with practiced calls. Fresh figs, crisp olives, hot bread, each competing for the ear and coin of early buyers. Market goers were veteran players who recognized the best stalls by sight, price, or a vendor's reputation for overseating. Markets were a social event as much as a shopping trip. Here, merchants traded news, rumors, and sometimes a little gossip to sweeten the deal. You might overhear talks about distant wars, the latest scandal in the Senate, or which gladiator was favored this season. Everyone from farmers to freedmen and slaves passed through these spaces, real melting pots of the city. Rituals punctuated market life, blending the practical with the spiritual. Vendors often began the day with small offerings or prayers to the Laris household gods, charged with protecting the home and business. A pinch of incense, a libation of wine poured on the ground, or a whispered request for lucky sales were common. Customers, too, observed customs. Some would touch statues near the market gates for good fortune, or cast a coin into a small shrine before purchase. The ancient Romans believed these rites could tip fate in favor of prosperity, or at least keep the olive oil flowing. The markets followed a rhythm. Morning hours brimmed with preparation and enthusiastic bargaining. By midday, the rush softened, patrons seeking shade and cool drinks. Afternoons were for restocking and early closures, while some stalls stayed open late for night owls and street wanderers seeking snacks after festivities. Seasonal changes added variety and ritual flavor. The arrival of spring brought markets bursting with vibrant greens and early fruits, a time celebrated with small festivals marking renewal. Autumn harvests filled baskets with grapes, nuts, and rich olives pressed fresh into new oil, creating moments of communal joy and gratitude. Food. Markets were also places of subtle hierarchy. Well-known vendors commanded steady clientele. Newcomers struggled for favor. Prices varied regionally and could be sources of dispute. Occasionally, disputes over weight or quality escalated into noisy street brawls, quickly mediated by local magistrates or simply cooled by a well-timed insult and a shared cup of watered wine. Rome's markets were labyrinthine rows of stalls spilling into side alleys, weaving through neighborhoods like veins. Stalls often specialized by goods. Fishmongers clustered near the river. Bakers held central squares, and spice merchants occupied quieter corners hidden behind open-air theaters or temples. This specialization created networks. A butcher might send customers to a specific olive vendor, who in turn recommended a particular baker. These informal alliances ensured quality and fostered a sense of community within the bustling commerce. Markets weren't free from shadowy edges. Pickpockets and con artists thrived in the crowd's ebb and flow. Vendors sometimes sold adulterated goods, stretched flour, diluted wine, though blatant fraud could lead to fines or worse. The tension between trust and suspicion flavored every transaction. At night, markets transformed. Most stalls closed, but some food vendors, tavern owners, and entertainers kept the city streets alive. Lanterns flickered, and the hum of conversation mingled with music and the clatter of cups. Night markets became venues for relaxation, storytelling, and counting the day's profits. For many Romans, the market was much more than a place to buy food, was a mirror of city life. It reflected social bonds, economic realities, and the nuanced dance between tradition and survival. Food was the constant thread weaving together the diverse tapestry of Rome's people. So, if you imagine yourself strolling through one of these ancient bazaars, picture the textures, rough burlap sacks, polished fruits, and chipped pottery, the sounds, the calls of hawkers, the laughter of children, the clinking coins, and the smells, the sour tang of vinegar, sweet ripeness of figs, and pungent hint of fermented fish. It's a sensory collage that brings to life the heartbeat of Rome's daily existence. Food in ancient Rome wasn't just about filling stomachs. It was tightly woven into the spiritual fabric of daily life. Meals often danced hand in hand with rituals, offerings, and divine acknowledgement. Eating was, in many ways, an act of worship. Romans believed the gods influenced every aspect of existence crops, whether health, and so fed with reverence and ritual, hoping to keep favor and avoid divine displeasure. The simple act of breaking bread was never mundane. It was a sacred exchange between humans and the divine. Before meals, it was common for Romans to say a small prayer or offer thanks to household gods like the Lares and Penates. These spirits protected the hearth and home, and their goodwill was considered essential for family prosperity. Even street vendors might sprinkle a bit of wine on the ground, a ritual libation to honor these invisible guardians. Religious festivals, too, centered on food. The Saturnalia, Lupercalia, and Vinalia Waran. Tea just excuses for partying. They featured carefully prescribed foods offered to gods and shared by the community. Sacrificial animals were common, and portions of meat were distributed among the people, blurring lines between sacred offerings and communal meals. Temples often had altars dedicated to particular gods of fertility, hearth, or grain. Offerings were presented here before planting or harvest, seeking blessings. In return, the community celebrated with feasts reflecting the bounty granted. Food, thus, was a tangible bond linking the mortal and immortal. Even dining itself had ceremonial elements, especially in elite homes. Guests reclined in arranged seating, and specialized prayers and gestures preceded courses. Hosts took care to properly honor gods within their homes, blending hospitality with devotion. An improperly offered prayer could, in theory, invite disaster or at least digestive discomfort. Certain foods held symbolic value. For instance, beans, while common, were sometimes taboo at funerals, possibly linked to beliefs about the soul's journey. Conversely, figs symbolized fertility and were offered at varied celebrations. Honey was sacred and often used in offerings for its purity and sweetness, both literal and metaphorical. Garum, that infamous fish sauce, perhaps ironically, had religious uses as well, showing its deep entrenchment in Roman life. Some recipes were even part of ancient medicinal and ritual texts, blurring the lines between culinary art and spiritual practice. Food also marked transitions, births, weddings, funerals, with each event accompanied by distinct dishes, sacrifices, or offerings. Meals during mourning periods differed, reflecting societal attitudes toward life, death, and the afterlife. Vending stalls sometimes doubled as spaces for small informal offerings. Shrines or statues near counters invited quick prayers or gestures asking for good fortune. Vendors might keep small tokens or images of gods nearby, ensuring divine favor and warding off bad luck. The interplay of food and religion was complex and omnipresent. Quietly guiding choices we might now consider purely practical. What to eat, when to eat, how to prepare, it all could reflect ancient Romans' attempt to live harmoniously with the seen and unseen forces shaping their world. In this light, a simple bowl of lentil stew or the crust of bread becomes something more. Small ritual, a daily prayer muted by the noise of the city, a humble offering from mortal hands to gods who watched quietly from beyond.
If Roman street food was the beating heart of the city, then its customers and their tailies were the pulse-colorful diverse. Sometimes oddly, tragic, and often quietly human. Imagine the vendor Gaius from earlier stirring lentil stew as a familiar figure approaches, Marcus a gladiator, off-duty, still bearing the grime and bruises of the arena. Marcus orders his usual pulls, thickened with extra oil, and a generous splash of garum. He doesn't say much. Gladiators were known for limited small talk anything. More might catch an opponent's attention. Gaius, aware of the tacit need for quiet, ladles out the meal with practiced silence. Nearby, a young woman named Livia stops in, each morning, buying a handful of salted fish and bread before heading to her job as a scribe in the forum. She chats briefly with the vendor, sometimes negotiating the price with a smile sharper than the knives behind the counter. Vendors knew their regulars well. The bickering and bartering were as much part of the ritual as the food itself. Then there was Publius, a retired soldier with a limp and a fondness for the smoky flavor of roasted chickpeas sold from a corner stall. He always arrived exactly at noon, no matter the weather. Enticed by the promise of his street vendor's trustworthy fare, he claimed that these tiny leguminous snacks were the secret to his survival, though. Likely it was luck and stubbornness. Street food stalls also witnessed moments of tragedy softened by routine. One vendor recalled a young boy who started as an errand runner, always hovering near the counter, curious about the cooking process. When the eruption of Vesuvius came, the boy vanished, last seen carrying a basket of bread to a neighbor. Such stories lingered, shared quietly over steamy bowls, a reminder that the city's smoke and fire could consume suddenly. On lighter days, vendors entertained gossip and rumors. One stall owner boasted of a customer who once tried to pay their bill with a rather dubious coin, a piece of a melted amulet from a goddess's shrine. The vendor laughed it off, but carefully passed the coin to a friend in the coin trade, turning misfortune into opportunity. Local legends sometimes grew around food as well. A well-known fishmonger stall was said to be blessed by Neptune, for good catches always followed purchases here. Some patrons left small offerings wrapped in parchment, hoping for favor. Superstition mingled with commerce seamlessly. Even food choices whispered about patrons' personalities and status. A vendor might know to reserve the freshest bread for a respected elder, or secretly increase the garlic for a particularly noisy client, because some things were best dealt with subtly. In Porto, Ostia's docks, sailors from far-flung provinces, mingled with Romans over shared plates of salted pork and flatbread, swapping stories of perilous voyages and strange lands. Their accents, thick but friendly, creating an international patchwork of street food culture. Emperors also dipped into these scenes, albeit incognito, or so they hoped. Nero is famously rumored to have wandered marketplaces disguised as a commoner, feigning interest in sausages and spiced wine. Most likely, he did so out of boredom or curiosity, though it had the side effect of humanizing the emperor. Of course, the fires and excesses overshadowed any moment of humility. And what of the food itself? Many customers returned obsessively to specific dishes, often because the imperfections lent character and familiarity. Street food was a dialogue between cook and eater, a slow negotiation played out in flavors, portions, and price. This culinary relationship also had a bittersweet edge. Loyal patrons sometimes helped vendors through lean times, buying extra portions or lending coins unseen by others. Vendors, in turn, extended credit or special deals. In this daily dance, survival depended on social bonds as much as ingredients. Occasionally, misunderstandings blossomed into stories remembered long after. One vendor once mistook a senator's son for a commoner and served him lastonely for the young noble later to praise the humility of the stall, much to the vendor's relieved surprise. Moments like this added a touch of human comedy beneath Rome's grandeur. So, behind the steaming pots and smoky counters, the street food scene was alive with characters, each with quirks, dreams, failures, and small triumphs. It was in every sense the human story of Rome told one bite at a time. Would you like Part 12 to explore food preservation and storage methods in ancient Rome for a practical journey, or gently wander into the role of festivals and public feasts in Roman food culture? Imagine the sprawling city of Rome, packed with millions of residents hungry every day. Now, imagine how challenging it was to keep food fresh without refrigerators, freezers, or even basic plastic wrap. The Romans had to get creative, pragmatic, even ingenious in preserving their meals and ingredients through heat, salt, smoke, and more. At the heart of Roman preservation was saltafun, called white gold, because of its crucial role in extending food's shelf life. Salt cured meats by drawing out moisture and creating an inhospitable environment for bacteria. Salty pork and fish were staples, both in urban markets and on long military campaigns. Timore solved the longer the preservation, though flavor took a bit of a toll. Fish, especially, relied heavily on preservation. Pickling and drying methods turned fresh fish into hardier staples, capable of surviving the journey from coastal markets to inland counters. That infamous fish sauce, garum, was itself a preservation method. Fermented fish guts, left to mellow in saline for weeks. Centuries before the phrase "aged to perfection" had a culinary meaning. Smoke was another preservation ally. Meats and cheeses were smoked over low fires, giving them a distinctive flavor and extending their usability. Vendors might keep these smoked goods hanging in stalls both as decoration and stockpile ready for sale or further cooking. Dryings on, or air drying, worked wonders on fruits, nuts, and herbs. Dried figs, dates, and olives could last through seasons, providing sweet or savory snacks long after the fresh harvest had faded. The trade routes ensured these dried goods traveled far, becoming staples across the empire. Grains were naturally resilient, but still vulnerable to pests. Stored in clay or wooden granaries, they required protection from rodents and moisture. Romans built raised floors and sealed containers to keep granaries dry and safe. Early pest control efforts that probably felt like a constant war between storage and infestation. Of course, wine and oil had their own preservation challenges. Amphari, those iconic narrow-necked jars sealed with resin or wax, kept wine fresh during transport and storage, though opening an ancient bottle was never a clean process. Olive oil, pressed fresh each autumn, was stored similarly, often in massive earthenware jars buried partially underground to keep temperature stable. Fermentation wasn't just for garum. It played a role in bread making and occasionally in vegetable preservation. Romans enjoyed sourdough-like bread with naturally occurring yeast, a subtle method of transforming humble grain into nourishing fare with a longer fresh window. Pickled vegetables, though less common, also appeared as preserved accompaniments for short-term storage. Cool cellars and wells helped, especially for dairy products like cheese and butter-like substances. These spaces maintained lower temperatures and could slow spoilage enough to stretch food's life by days or weeks. However, despite these methods, Spoilage was a daily risk. Vendors had to be vigilant, inspecting produce carefully and rotating stocks rapidly. A spoiled batch meant loss of income and customers, so experienced and sharp senses were invaluable. Sharp noses and quick eyes were as necessary for food sellers as a good ladle or sturdy pot. Storing food also shaped culinary habits. The tendency toward using strong flavors like garum, vinegar, and spices partly masked the less than fresh quality of some ingredient, the pragmatic accommodation rather than mere indulgence. So, that pungent scent wafting from thermopolia wasn't just seasoning, it was survival. Preservation techniques influenced meal structures, too. Dishes based on dried or salted ingredients endured better than freshenly recipes, which required swift consumption. Seasonal shifts meant menus changed, not just by preference, but by what could safely last. Surprisingly, ancient Rome tackled preservation on an industrial scale. The remains of huge salt pans and fish processing facilities reveal sophisticated production, tailored for the city's massive scale and far-flung army needs. Behind every savory loaf or rich stew was a logistics web spanning continents. The delicate balance between preserving food and preserving flavor demanded knowledge passed down through generations of cooks and vendors. While modern palates might cringe at some preserved flavors, the methods ensured Rome's streets kept bustling and bellies stayed full, day after day. If the streets and markets were Rome's everyday dining rooms, festivals and public feasts were its grand banquet halls, bursting with noise, aromas, and a kind of collective indulgence that temporarily erased the city's harsh realities. Romans loved a good festival, especially one involving lots of food. It wasn't just about eating, it was about celebration, social cohesion, honoring the gods, and occasionally reminding the populace who held the real power by throwing impressively lavish banquets. The calendar chock full of festivals served both spiritual and political roles. Some honored deities like Saturn Saturnalia, Bacchus Bacchanalia, or Ceres, linking food rituals directly to divine favor and seasonal cycles. Others marked historic events or served civic purposes, combining religion, politics, and social spectacle. Saturnalia, perhaps the most famous, was a December week of rollicking Ravasso slaves ate first. Gifts were exchanged, and social norms relaxed. Markets overflowed with specialties. Sweet cakes, spiced wine, roasted meats. The city transformed into an edible playground, if only briefly. The laughter and excess centered on food, wine, and public merriment, a counterpoint to the daily grind. Public feasts often followed religious sacrifices. After an animal was offered to the gods, its meat might be distributed among attendees. These moments blurred lines between sacred and profane, turning sacrifice into shared sustenance. The food carried spiritual weight. Eating it reinforced communal bonds and honored divine generosity. Emperors and magistrates hosted public banquets to curry favor and pacify the masses. These events were part spectacle, part political theater, with food playing the starring role. Giant tables groaned under the weight of bread, olives, cheeses, and occasionally more extravagant fare. The message was clear. The state cared and could provide. Markets and theaters spilled their crowds into temporary food stalls during festivals, serving the appetite of joyous revelers. Street vendors thrived, often seeing the season's best earnings as simmering pots turned over quickly to feed hungry crowds. Feasts also marked life's milestones. Weddings, funerals, triumphs featured specific foods and customs. Funeral banquets, quieter and more somber, tasted of barley cakes and simple fare, reflecting grief and remembrance, while weddings dazzled with honeyed delicacies and shared wine, symbolizing fertility and union. Each festival followed unique culinary rules. During some, the consumption of meat was banned or restricted, focusing instead on fruits, grains, and vegetables, an austerity that balanced other periods of excess. Such dietary shifts were as much about spiritual preparation as food availability. Food gifts were common during festivals. Honey cakes, dried fruits, and spiced nuts passed among friends, neighbors, and patrons as tokens of goodwill. This gentle economy of giving reinforced social networks more subtly than coins or favors. Behind every food celebration lay logistical challenges. Supplying entire cities with feast-ready fare demanded coordination. Farmers accelerated harvests, fishermen worked overtime, bakers prepared special loaves, and wine producers pressed new batches, timed perfectly to peak festival days. Banquets involved ritualized courses, each served with careful timing and significance. Wine flowed freely, often mixed with spices or sweeteners. Music and poetry accompanied plates, turning meals into performances with edible scripts. The sensory experience of festivals was overwhelming, a blend of scent, sound, sight, and taste that carved unforgettable moments into the memory of participants. The smoke curling from burning offerings, the chatter of crowds, the shiny glaze of honey on cakes, and the ringing clink of cups all mingled to create a shared cultural language. Yet, festivals weren't without darker undertones. Excess could lead to disorder, and authorities closely monitored festivities, wary of potential unrest, masked by food, while a joyous binding force also held power, a reminder of who could provide and who might face hunger. Through all this, festivals sustained Rome's social fabric. They momentarily softened inequalities, allowed communal reaffirmation, and ensured that food's role extended well beyond mere survival into the realm of identity, belief, and unity. So, as a Roman wandered from home to feast, street to temple, they carried not just a stomach but a spirit hungry for connection, recognition, and meaning, all woven through the simple, profound act of sharing food. Imagine a Roman kitchen, or rather, the multitude of kitchens scattered across the city's insular taverns and street stalls. It wasn't exactly a place of serenity and gleaming appliances. Instead, it was a humbler domain marked by smoke, soot, busy hands, and the constant negotiation with heat and flame. Cooking in ancient Rome was less about fancy gadgets and more about direct methods tuned to available ingredients and social expectations. Whether a vendor ladling lentil stew or a noble's cook preparing elaborate banquets, these techniques formed the bedrock of Roman dining. Boiling and simmering were staples. Pots of earthenware or bronze hung over simple charcoal or wood braziers, where water slowly dissolved grains or softened vegetables. The low and slow method wasn't just practical. It tenderized tough or dried ingredients, making them palatable and digestible. This was the slow cooking of antiquity, long before crockpots, but no less effective. Frying was also common. Vendors boiled or fried chickpea cakes, sausages, and small fish in olive oil over portable metal pans or shallow clay vessels. Frying added flavor and a desirable crispness, a prized contrast to the often soft or mushy boiled items. Roasting on spits or in ovens was reserved mostly for elites, but not unknown to street vendors, who used simple racks or skewers over open flame to cook chunks of meat or dormice. The smoky char delivered flavor but required constant tending, a risky task in cramped, fire-prone settings. Baking occurred in communal or private ovens, usually brick or stone constructions, heated with wood fires. Bakers were masterful engineers of heat, creating varying temperatures by controlling fire size and oven closure. Bread, cakes, and pastries relied heavily on this method. Grinding grains was central and often done at home with simple stone corn stew circular stones, one turning atop the other. This laborious task shattered grain into cores or fine flour, affecting everything from bread texture to porridge consistency. Roasting and toasting enhanced flavors, and preserved goods, nuts, seeds, and even grains, toasted over a fire added complexity. Vendors might offer toasted chickpeas or nuts as snacks, enjoyed between heavier meals. Mixing and seasoning balanced the often plain foundation dishes. Herbs, salt, vinegar, and garum were stirred in with wooden spoons, evidence of skilled hands, fine-tuning basic ingredients for taste and preservation. Utensils and tools bore the marks of constant use. Clay pots, prone to chipping but resilient, were ubiquitous. Bronze vessels added status but were less common for everyday cooking due to cost and maintenance. Cooking tools were practical. Knives with wooden or bone handles, ladles for serving, and pounding tools for grinding herbs or meat. The simple kitchen counter might include a mortar and pestle, essential for grinding spices or creating pastes. These tools represented the contrast between rustic cooking and the elaborate preparations demanded in upscale homes. Storage vessels amphare dolia and jars played dual roles, preserving ingredients and doubling as cooking or serving containers. Their shapes and sizes varied with function. Sealing techniques used wax or clay stoppers, crucial for protecting precious oils, wine, or dry goods. Fuel was a constant concern. Wood, charcoal, and sometimes dried twigs powered fires. Vendors and cooks alike had to balance fuel consumption against heat needs, an art form unto itself. USD would sometimes imparted flavors akin to modern smokers, though the smoke also posed health risks over time. Water, ever essential, was drawn from public fountains or wells and heated for cooking and washing. Fire and water, the basic elements of cooking, defined the rhythm and possibility of every meal. Cooking was communal whenever possible. Larger kitchens or thermopolia often had multiple cooks or helpers passing ingredients, steering pots, and keeping fires alive. Teamwork eased the demands of constant food preparation in tight, hot spaces. Overall, Roman cooking was a marriage of simplicity and skill, limited by technology but expanded by human ingenuity. The sensory experience was rough. The hiss of oil, the smell of roasting herbs, the clang of metal against pottery, and the sight of steaming earthenware counters amid bustling city noise. In the unglamorous heat and smoke lay a world of flavor cultivated through centuries, an ancient culinary tradition that fed an empire, one fire, pot, and hungry patron at a time. When we think of ancient Roman food, the mind might drift to roasted peacocks or flamingo tongues, glamorous, eccentric, and, frankly, a little bizarre. But behind these extravagant images lies a vast archive of recipes that grounded Roman daily life, feeding millions with practical yet occasionally indulgent dishes. Much of what we know comes from Apicius, an ancient manuscript compiling recipes likely from the 1st century. Think of it as Roman comfort food meets culinary showmanship, sometimes baffling, often tasty, and always revealing. Let's start with pulse, the backbone of Roman cuisine. A simple porridge made from farro or barley, cooked slowly with water or broth. Apicius suggests thickening it with cheese or honey for variety. Vendors would reheat it daily, stirring in herbs or bits of meat when available. It was humble food, but with endless variations, from plain sustenance to something richer depending on means and mood. Next up, Icetia aumentata, often dubbed the ancient Roman hamburger though. Imagine a burger with pine nuts, pepper, and a splash of garum. These ground meat patties were fried on a pan over olive oil, then served with bread or as part of a larger meal. Something tells us even modern fast food junkies might appreciate this antiquity. Fish dishes ranged widely. Patina de piscibus was a popular fish casserole, layering chopped fish with eggs, wine, herbs, and garum, then baked gently. Texture was vittle creamy, firm, and infused with that unmistakable pungent sauce. Freshness mattered less than fleur. The cooking masked many imperfections. Speaking of garum, it was the silent partner in many dishes. A splash here or a drizzle there transformed simple stews and vegetables into complex, punchy meals. Romans loved it almost as much as we love ketchup. The smell, admittedly, was an acquired taste. Vegetables were rarely solo stars, but found homes in moritum. A herb and cheese spread pounded in a mortar and eaten with bread. Simple, quick, and flavorful. It was the soldier-s and farmer-s friend all. The zest of a garlicky pesto without the fancy French name. Pastries deserve mention. Le baume was a cheese and honey cake, often shaped for religious offerings, lightly baked and sweet. These treats punctuated feasts and served as small tokens of celebration or gratitude. Roman recipes also embraced sweet and savory combinations. Dishes might include fruit soaked in wine, alongside roasted meats, or honeyed nuts, paired with salted cheeses. Experiments in balancing flavors that sometimes bordered on culinary innovation or perhaps excess. Cooking methods reflected recipe demands. Oven-baked dishes needed precise heat management, pots required constant stirring, and sauces demanded patience as flavors melt. Expert cooks respected timing and ingredient quality, knowing a slight error turned a feast into a fiasco. Many recipes call for odd ingredients, now rare or extinct silphium, a prized herb lost to history, considered the ancient equivalent of both garlic and expensive spice, or dormice, roasted and stuffed for special occasions. These curiosities today add a mystique, but also show the diverse palate Romans. What we see in these recipes is a culinary culture, fluent in adaptation, practical enough to sustain empires, theatrical enough to please emperors, and surprisingly modern in its layering of flavors and textures. So with a rite, as a stall, vendor ladling lentil stew, thickened with herbs, or a patrician's cook, layering fish with eggs and wine. Roman food was a living tradition, one part necessity, one part art, and one part abundant history simmered slowly over centuries. Imagine Rome not just as a city, but as a massive hub at the heart of a sprawling empire, where food wasn't just a matter of cooking and eating, but a vast, complex operation demanding precision, diplomacy, and a bit of luck. The city's appetite was legendary. Feeding a population estimated at over 1 million required an intricate system of food supply, from the fertile fields of Egypt and the grain plains of North Africa to the vineyards of Gaul and the olive groves of Hispania. Grain was the empire's lifeblood, especially wheat, which arrived in vast quantities shipped down the Mediterranean in huge grain convoys. These shipments were so critical that grain supply threatened social stability. Delays or poor harvests sparked riots. The cura annone, Rome's grain dole system, became a key political tool to maintain public order. Ports like Ostia and Puteoli bustled with activity, unloading ships laden with amphorae filled with olive oil, wine, salted fish, and dried fruits. These hubs functioned not just as trade centers, but as logistical points where goods were stored, taxed, and distributed through the city. Behind these operations were merchants, brokers, and ship owners, navigating vast networks over sea and land. Roads like the Via Appia Warren, Tege's military routes, but vital arteries, ensuring timely delivery of perishable and staple goods alike. Food wasn't uniform. Regional specialties flowed into Rome, creating a diverse culinary scene. Citrus fruits from the east, spiced wines from Gaul, and salted fish from the coasts brought new tastes and ingredients into the marketplace, reflecting Rome's vast reach. Storage was a major concern. Granaries, olive presses, and wine cellars dotted the city and surrounding provinces, designed to hold surplus and buffer against scarcity. Architects even designed these structures with ventilation to prevent spoilage, early examples of food engineering. Meanwhile, the urban poor relied heavily on state-subsidized grain. The importance of this system extended beyond nutrition. It was a social glue, a daily reminder of the emperor's largesse and the empire's ability to sustain its citizens. Luxury foods traveled longer and demanded more delicate handling. Spices, silphium, nuts, and preserved delicacies marked status and power for the city's elite, underscoring trade's role in social signaling. Economic fluctuations, wars, piracy, bad weather could disrupt supplies, sending shockwaves through the food system. These events tested the resilience of trade networks and forced constant adaptations, such as shifting trade routes or rationing. Merchants operated in a competitive environment, but often forged alliances and guilds, providing stability in an otherwise risky business. These networks extended to distant provinces, knitting the empire together through the simple, essential thread of food. In sum, feeding Rome was not just about pots and pans, but about diplomacy, engineering, politics, and economics, making every meal the product of a vast and delicate empire-wide choreography. Food was never just fuel in ancient Rome. It was an essential thread woven through the social fabric, defining status, relationships, and daily rhythms. Eating was as much about connection and, occasionally, display as it was about sustenance. For the common Roman, meals were simple but ritualized events. Breakfast, or ientaculum, was often modest. Bread, some fruit or cheese, and watered-down wine or posca, a vinegar drink, favored by soldiers and laborers, often eaten quickly. Sometimes on the go, It was the practical start to a hard day. Lunch or prandium was similarly light leftovers. Cold meats, or bread with olives. It was a flexible meal, grabbed between work or errands, eaten standing or sitting on street steps, often at thermopolia or food stalls. Dinasina was the main social event and could stretch for hours in wealthier households. It was a stage for conversation, negotiation, and sometimes subtle power plays. Even modest homes tried to make dinner in Vitinga, flicker of oil lamps, a few dishes garnished to impress. The act of eating was laden with social cues. Reclining on couches was reserved for the elite, signaling leisure and status. The common folk ate seated or standing, often fast and functional. Serving order, portion size, and even choice of ingredients reflected hierarchy. Food sharing was a key social glue. Neighborhoods, guilds, and families often pooled resources for communal meals or celebrations. This fostered a sense of belonging and mutual support amid the city's often harsh realities. Dining could also reveal tensions, disputes over seating, serving, or even who paid the bill occasionally flared into minutes. Yet these disputes were also opportunities to affirm social bonds, tested and strengthened over shared food. Hospitality was a defining value. Inviting someone to dine was a gesture of goodwill and trust. Guests were often greeted with small tokens, bread, cheese, or wine, and honoring guests was a mark of personal and familial honor. Food and moral virtue were intertwined in public discourse. Writers and philosophers debated moderation versus excess, praising simple fare as a pathway to a virtuous life and condemning gluttony as reflective of moral decay. Yet, even critics rarely escape the temptation of fine dishes for special occasions. Children learned food customs early: what to eat, how to eat, what to avoid. They also played roles in meals, fetching water, helping prepare simple dishes, and occasionally feasting on scraps or specially made treats. Markets, taverns, and food stalls served as social spaces. Vendors weren't just sellers, but local storytellers, news sources, and connectors. Their stalls witnessed life's small moments, celebrations, farewells, quiet comforts. After hard days, the connection between food and identity extended across the empire's diversity. Immigrants brought their own food customs, blending with Roman tastes and creating a shared culinary culture that evolved over time. In all, food in daily life was a textured, living force, not just about nutrition, but about who people were, how they related, and how a vast, complex city found itself at the table together. Food wasn't just sustenance in ancient Rome. It was medicine, poison, and prescription rolled into one, an essential part of how Romans understood health, well-being, and the delicate balance between life and death. The medical wisdom of the time intertwined diet with bodily humors. The four fluids believed to govern health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Eating was a way of balancing these forces. Too much or too little of certain foods could tip the scales toward illness or vitality. Physicians like Galen wrote extensively about food's role in healing, prescribing specific diets for conditions ranging from digestive troubles to mental imbalances. Chickpeas, for example, were considered cooling and beneficial for the stomach, while garlic was a stimulant, potentially good for circulation but dangerous in excess. Food allergies and intolerances weren't understood, but certain foods were taboo or avoided due to observed negative effects. Beans were linked to spiritual beliefs and often excluded from funeral feasts, possibly because they were thought to interfere with the soul's journey. Romans also used food as external medicine. Olive oil, abundant and revered, was applied to skin as a moisturizer, cleanser, or mild antiseptic. Honey served as an ingredient in poultices and salves, prized for its antibacterial properties. Excess was a common culprit in Roman medical thought. Overindulgence in rich foods, wine, or spices was blamed for a wide range of ailments, from digestive upsets to more vague complaints like lethargy or melancholy. Street food vendors, aware of health concerns, might add herbs like mint or dill, known for digestive ease. Vinegar diluted in water was a common drink to stimulate appetite and aid digestion. Yet, The risks of spoiled or contaminated food remained high. Typhoid, dysentery, and food poisoning were common hazards. Water quality was also a concern. Though aqueducts brought fresh water into Rome, wells and public fountains sometimes contained microbial risks. Boiling water or mixing it with wine or vinegar helped to reduce danger, and wine was also valued for its presumed health benefits. Fasting and diet regulation played roles in religious and medical practice, with some recommending periods of limited food intake to cleanse the body or spirit. Such practices were more common among physicians and philosophers than the general populace, but reveal the complex relationship Romans had with food. Mental health and food also linked. Certain foods were thought to influence mood. Lettuce was prescribed as a calming agent, while overstimulation from heavy meals was cautioned against. The mind-body connection through diet wasn't fully understood, but clearly sensed. Despite these insights, food-related health challenges were frequent. Poor hygiene, lack of refrigeration, and urban overcrowding amplified risks. Foodborne illness could sweep through neighborhoods, and vendors themselves sometimes suffered chronic conditions linked to their trade. In sum, food in ancient Rome was medicine, ritual, an occasional poison, a reminder of the precarious balance between nourishment and risk. It shaped not only bodies, but understanding of the human condition, echoing in the medical texts, street markets, and dining rooms of an empire.